She walked 2,500 miles through the snow to marry a stranger. She did not know the man whose name was on the letter had not written a single word of it. She did not know his first wife had been murdered 3 years ago. And she did not know the
Stay
killer
with
was
me.
already
Don't
waiting
close
for
your
her
eyes.
on the mountain. This is the story of
I
Clara May
can't.
Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina, and the night she walked into the Silver Spurs Saloon. The wind off the Bitterroot Range had teeth that November night. It came down through the lodgepole pines and the Douglas firs and the western larches with a sound like a held breath finally released, and it carried with it the first hard snow of the season. Not the gentle Charleston snow Clara May Bennett remembered from her childhood, the kind that melted on a wool coat and left only a darkening mark. This was Montana snow, mountain snow, the kind that meant business. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew that her shoes were thin, that her dress was too light, that her fingers inside the cotton gloves had gone past cold into something worse, something numb and distant, as if they belonged to another woman entirely. She walked the half mile from the train depot at Copper Creek with her carpet bag dragging behind her like a small, stubborn animal, and she counted her steps to keep from thinking about how alone she was. 100, 200, 300. The lights of the Silver Spur Saloon appeared through the falling snow, like a promise made by a god she was no longer certain existed. She stopped at the door. She set the carpet bag down. She pressed her palm flat against the rough plank wood, and she made herself breathe. From inside came laughter and the smell of wood smoke, and something cooking, something with onions and meat, and her stomach, which had been silent for 2 days, suddenly woke up and made a sound she was ashamed of. She had eaten the last of her bread and apple yesterday morning on the train somewhere east of Bozeman. She had drunk cold coffee a kind conductor had given her at a depot, whose name she could not now remember. She had nothing in her pockets but a folded letter she had read so many times the creases were beginning to tear, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and a Bible her father had given her on her 10th birthday with the words, "To my Clara May, who will one day be braver than she knows," written inside the cover in his careful preacher's hand. She pushed the door open. The warmth hit her first, a wall of its cigarette smoke and lamp oil, and human bodies pressed together against the cold. Then the silence. She had not expected the silence. She had not understood until this moment what it meant to be a woman alone walking into a room full of men in a town like this. Every face turned toward her. The piano player in the corner missed a note and then stopped playing altogether. A man at the bar set his glass down very carefully as if afraid of waking something. Someone whispered. Someone laughed low and ugly. Clara May kept her chin lifted the way her father had taught her, but inside her chest, her heart was a small, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She walked to the bar. She set the carpet bag at her feet. She looked up at the bartender, a heavy man with red whiskers and small, careful eyes, and she said the words she had practiced all the way down the snowy road from the depot. "Sir, I have no money. But if there is any food in the kitchen that would otherwise be thrown away, any leftovers at all, I would be willing to wash dishes until dawn to earn them. I have not eaten in 2 days. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work." The bartender stared at her. For a long moment, she thought he might say something kind. Then his mouth twisted into a smile that was not a smile at all, and he opened his mouth to speak, and Clara May Bennett braced herself for the first of what she expected to be many cruelties. But the voice that came was not his. It came from the darkest corner of the saloon, from a table she had not noticed when she walked in, and it was deep and slow and quiet as a river running under ice. It said, "Ma'am, you come over here and sit down with us. My supper is still untouched, and it would be a poor sort of insult to let it go cold." Clara May turned. 3 men were standing up from the corner table. They stood up at the same time with the same unhurried movement, and for one strange dreaming moment, she thought her exhausted eyes were seeing triple. Then she understood. They were not 3 images of one man. They were 3 men who looked like one man, triplets. Each of them well over 6 feet tall, each of them wide through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent their lives doing work that broke smaller men, each of them with the same chestnut brown hair, shot through with sun, the same sharp cheekbones, the same steady whiskey-colored eyes. They wore deer-hide coats and worn leather boots, and they carried themselves like they belonged to the mountains and the mountains belonged to them. The one who had spoken stepped forward. He was the one with a thin, pale scar running through his left eyebrow. An old scar, the kind earned a long time ago and made peace with. He moved past her to the door which she had left open in her shock, and he closed it gently against the wind. Then he came back and he did something that no man had done for Clara May Bennett in 6 years. He took off his own coat, his heavy deer-hide coat that smelled of pine smoke and leather and snow, and he draped it over her small, shaking shoulders without a word. "Come on now, ma'am," he said. "Soup's hot." She let herself be led to the table. She did not think she could have refused if she had wanted to. Her legs were shaking, and her vision was beginning to swim at the edges from hunger and cold, and the great rolling exhaustion of 9 days of train travel and 6 years of grief and one terrible October decision that had brought her 2,500 miles from the only home she had ever known. The middle brother, who moved with the coiled stillness of a man who had once been a soldier, pulled out a chair for her with a roughness that was somehow gentle. The youngest, the one whose face was the softest of the three, signaled to the bartender for another bowl of stew and a fresh round of cornbread. "My name is Eli Hartwell," said the man with the scar through his eyebrow. He sat down across from her so she could see his face in the lamplight. "These are my brothers. Jed is the one looking like he wants to fight someone. Wyatt is the one trying to pretend he isn't worried about you." Wyatt smiled at her, shy and warm. Jed grunted something that might have been a greeting and looked away toward the window. "I am Clara May Bennett," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. She tried again. "I am Clara May Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina, and I am very pleased to meet you, Mr. Hartwell." Eli Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his whiskey-colored eyes, something she could not read, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been expecting her without knowing he was expecting her. As if the door of the Silver Spur Saloon had opened tonight on a meeting that had been written somewhere in a book none of them had read. The stew arrived. Clara May looked down at it. Steam rose into her face and her eyes filled with tears she absolutely refused to shed in front of these strange, enormous gentlemen. She picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking so badly she could not bring it to her mouth. She set the spoon down and folded her hands in her lap, and she closed her eyes and she said very quietly the grace her father had taught her when she was 4 years old. When she opened her eyes, all three brothers were watching her, and the youngest one, Wyatt, had taken off his hat. She ate slowly. She made herself eat slowly because she knew from a winter in Charleston, after her parents had died, what happened to a starving body that ate too fast. The stew was thick and dark and full of venison and turnips and onions cooked down soft. The cornbread was warm. The coffee they brought her was bitter and strong and the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She ate and she did not speak, and the three brothers did not press her. They drank their coffee, and they let her have the dignity of her hunger. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down very carefully on the napkin beside it. She took a small breath. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her traveling dress, and she brought out the letter. It was creased and soft from being read 100 times. She set it on the table between herself and Eli Hartwell, and she said, "Sir, I believe I am here at your invitation." Eli looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. He did not need to. Something in his shoulders went very still, and Clara May watched a small, terrible understanding pass across his face. He looked up at his brothers. Wyatt would not meet his eyes. Wyatt was suddenly extremely interested in his coffee cup. Eli closed his own eyes, just for a moment. Then he opened them and he looked at Clara May with an expression of such quiet, wretched honesty that she felt her heart turn over in her chest. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I owe you the truth, and I owe it to you right now before another minute passes. I did not write that letter. The world tilted. Clara May heard herself say very calmly, I beg your pardon. I did not write it. My brother Wyatt wrote it. He wrote it 3 months ago without my knowledge. He used my name because I am the eldest and because the advertisement needed a name to answer to. He did it because. Eli stopped. He looked at his brother. Wyatt had gone the color of new ash. He did it because 3 years ago I lost my wife, ma'am. And in the 3 years since I have not been a man worth being around, I have been a stone with a beard. And Wyatt, who loves me more than he should, decided that what I needed was a woman who could remind me how to be alive. So he answered an advertisement on my behalf. He wrote letters in my voice. He sent the train ticket from money he saved trapping winter mink. And he never told me, Miss Bennett. He never told me until the morning I rode down to Copper Creek to meet a stranger who thought she was meeting her future husband. Clara May sat very still. Outside the saloon, the wind picked up. A draft moved across the floor and lifted the corner of the letter on the table. How long have you known, she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. 3 days, said Eli Hartwell. He told me 3 days ago. I have not slept since. I have been trying to think how to tell you. I have been trying to think of any way to do this that would not break what I can already see as a heart that has been broken too many times already. She picked up the letter. She folded it once. She folded it twice. She put it back into the inner pocket of her dress against her chest, the way she had carried it for the 9 days of the train ride, the way she had carried it for 6 weeks before that, the way she had pressed her hand against it through the cotton of her dress, whenever she had been afraid, which was always. She stood up, or she tried to. Her legs would not quite hold her. She set her palm flat against the table, and she pushed herself upright by force of will. The deer hide coat slipped from her shoulders. Wyatt caught it before it hit the floor, and he stood up too, and his eyes were wet, and he was opening his mouth to apologize, and Clara May held up one small ungloved hand and stopped him. Mr. Hartwell, she said. She was looking at Wyatt now, the youngest brother, the one who had written the letter that had carried her 2,500 miles across a country she had never seen. Please do not apologize to me. I think you did a kind thing for a brother you love. I think you did it the only way you knew how. The fault is not yours. The fault is mine for being a woman foolish enough to believe that a stranger's words on a piece of paper could be the same thing as a home. She turned to Eli. Mr. Hartwell, the eldest, I will repay the cost of the train ticket. I do not know how and I do not know when, but I am the daughter of a Methodist preacher, and I do not take charity that I cannot return. If you will tell me where to send the money, I will send it the moment I have it. Until then, I will trouble you no further. I thank you for the supper. It was the kindest meal I have eaten in 6 years. She picked up her carpet bag. The handle was wet from the snow it had dragged through. She turned toward the door of the Silver Spur Saloon, and she took one step and then another. Her plan, such as it was, had collapsed into nothing in the space of 2 minutes. She did not know where she would go. She knew only that she would not sit at this table 1 second longer than her dignity allowed. And her dignity, which was the only thing she had carried unbroken from Charleston, was telling her to leave now before the tears that were rising in her throat could make a fool of her in front of these 3 strange, enormous, gentle men. She was 3 steps from the door when Eli Hartwell said, Miss Bennett, stop. She did not stop. He said it again louder. Miss Bennett, stop, please. She stopped. She did not turn around. She could not. If she turned around, she would weep, and she had decided in the year her parents died that she would never weep in front of a man again as long as she lived. She heard him stand up. She heard him cross the floor of the saloon, slow and deliberate, and the room was watching them now. Every man in the Silver Spur was watching this woman in the navy blue traveling dress, and this giant of a mountain man in his shirt sleeves, and Clara May could feel the weight of all those eyes, and she did not care. She did not care about any of them. She only wanted to be outside in the snow, where no one would see her face. Eli Hartwell stopped beside her. He did not touch her. He bent his head down so that his voice would reach only her ears, and he spoke very quietly and very clearly. Miss Bennett, the temperature outside the saloon will reach 20 below zero before midnight tonight. There is no boarding house in Copper Creek that will rent a room to a woman alone after 8 o'clock in the evening, and it is now past 9. The depot master goes home at sundown, and the depot is locked. The church here has been closed since the preacher's wife took ill in October. There is no shelter in this town for what you are, which is a stranger and a woman and broke. If you walk out that door tonight, ma'am, with all the strength I have, I am telling you, you will not see the sun come up tomorrow. You will freeze to death in a snowdrift before 3 in the morning, and some Hartwell or some other rancher will find you on the road in April when the thaw comes, and that will be the end of Miss Clara May Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina, who came 2,500 miles to find a home and instead found nothing. Clara May closed her eyes. 2 tears, exactly 2, ran down her cheeks before she could stop them. She let them fall. She did not wipe them away. There was no point pretending now. What would you have me do, Mr. Hartwell? She said. I would have you come home with us tonight, said Eli Hartwell. Our cabin is 10 miles up the mountain. It is warm. It has a room with a door that locks from the inside, and the lock is good, and I will swear to you on the grave of my father that no man under that roof will trouble you. I am not asking you to marry me. I am not asking you to be anything to me. I am asking you to live through this winter under our roof as our guest. And when the spring comes, if you wish to go, I will personally drive you to Helena, and I will buy you a ticket to anywhere on this continent you wish to go, and I will give you $50 on top of it so you have something in your pocket when you arrive. That is what I am offering you. That is the bargain. And ma'am, I am offering it not because I pity you, but because the alternative is to let a good woman die in the snow tonight, and a Hartwell does not let that happen. Not while we are still drawing breath. Clara May opened her eyes. She turned slowly until she was looking up at him. He was so much taller than she was that she had to tilt her head back. His face in the lamplight was weathered and tired, and absolutely without deception. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to the firelight, and they were waiting for her answer with a patience that had no edge to it, no pressure, only the steady, honest waiting of a man who had said what he meant and would abide by whatever she decided. Why, she said. Why, what, ma'am? Why would you do this? You owe me nothing. I am a stranger. I am a mistake your brother made. You could pay for a room over the saloon and be quit of me by morning. Eli Hartwell looked at her for a long time, because 3 years ago he said, my wife died because I was not there to keep her safe, and I have been carrying that for 3 years. And I do not believe that God Almighty sent you to that door tonight by accident, Miss Bennett. I do not believe in accidents anymore. I believe that sometimes a man gets a second chance to do the thing he failed to do the first time. And I believe that if I let you walk out that door tonight, I will spend the rest of my life knowing I let it happen twice. I am asking you to come home with us so that I can sleep, ma'am. As much as I am asking for your sake, I am asking for mine. Clara May Bennett, daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina, looked into the face of Eli Hartwell of Black Pine Hollow, Montana territory, and she saw a man telling her the truth. She nodded. It was the smallest of nods. It was the size of a sparrow. But Eli Hartwell saw it, and something in his shoulders eased a fraction, and he turned and looked back at his brothers, and Wyatt was already standing up and putting on his coat, and Jed was already moving toward the door to bring the wagon around. All right then, said Eli Hartwell. Let's get you home, Miss Bennett. The word home did something to her chest that she would not understand for many weeks to come. She would never forget the ride up the mountain that night. The wagon was a heavy buckboard with a canvas cover, and Jed handled the reins from the front bench, while Eli sat beside him with a rifle laid across his knees, and Wyatt rode in the back with Clara May, and arranged a heavy buffalo hide robe across her lap and another around her shoulders. The lantern hanging from the wagon hoop swung as the horses pulled and threw a small, dancing circle of gold across the snow. Beyond that circle was a darkness deeper than any she had ever known. In Charleston, the night was always faintly silvered by lamps in windows and the moon on the harbor. Out here, the dark was the kind of dark that had been waiting since before there were people to see it. The road wound up through a forest of trees so tall she could not see their tops. Wyatt, sitting across from her with his hands folded on his knees, began to name them softly as they passed. That one with the long needles is a ponderosa pine. You can put your nose right up against the bark in summer, and it smells like vanilla. That smaller one is a lodgepole. The Indians used to make their taipi poles from those, which is where the name comes from. That big one with the gray bark is a Douglas fir. My father said one of those can live 300 years if it is left alone. He liked to say the trees out here knew our great-great-grandchildren before we knew them ourselves. Clara May listened. She did not have anything to say, but she listened, and something about the quiet way Wyatt named the trees made her feel less afraid. She studied his face in the lantern light. He was the gentlest of the three brothers. You could see it in the set of his mouth. He was the kind of man who would write a letter on behalf of a brother he loved and would mean every word of it and would never imagine the trouble it might cause. "Mr. Wyatt," she said after a long while. "Just Wyatt, ma'am, please." "Wyatt, may I ask you a question?" "You may ask me anything." "The letters you wrote in your brother's name, were they true? The things you said about him, about the cabin, about the life there?" Wyatt looked at her steadily. "Every word, Miss Bennet. I changed nothing. I only signed his name. The man you read about in those letters is my brother. I did not invent him. I just borrowed his pen." Clara May nodded slowly. She turned her face toward the canvas wall of the wagon, and she watched the small dancing lantern light, and she thought about that for a long time as the wagon climbed. She thought about how strange a thing it was to have come 2,500 miles for a man who did not exist, only to find that he did exist, and that he was sitting on the front bench of this wagon with a rifle across his knees and a wife buried somewhere on his land and 3 years of silence behind his eyes. The cabin appeared. She did not see it until they were almost upon it because the snow had grown thick again and the trees crowded close to the road, but suddenly Jed pulled the horses up, and there it was, rising out of the dark like something built by giants. It was bigger than she had imagined. 2 stories of squared timber, hand-hewn the logs as thick around as a barrel. A stone chimney climbed one wall, and smoke came out of it in a steady plume, because Wyatt had banked the fire before they left, and the fire was still alive waiting for them. A horse barn stood off to one side. A smaller building, she would later learn, was a smokehouse stood beyond that. There was a porch along the front of the cabin with a single rocking chair on it, and the rocking chair was rimed with snow. And Clara May Bennet, who had never seen any of this before, felt a strange, sharp pang of something she did not have a name for. Eli Hartwell came around to the back of the wagon and held up his hand to help her down. She put her own hand in his. His hand was rough as bark and warm even through her cold cotton glove, and the size of it made hers look like a child's. He lifted her down without effort, as if she weighed nothing, which in truth, after 9 days of train food and 6 years of grief, she nearly did. He set her on her feet in the snow, and he let go of her hand the moment she had her balance, and Clara May understood, without being told, that this man was going to be very careful, for as long as she was under his roof, never to touch her 1 second longer than necessary. She would be grateful for that, and she would also in time find herself wishing it were otherwise. But that was a thought for another night. Tonight there was only the cabin and the cold and the long climb of porch steps. The door swung open. Warmth poured out. She stepped across the threshold of Black Pine Hollow for the first time, and she stopped and she stared. The cabin was nothing she had been prepared for. She had expected a rough trapper's hut. She had expected dirt floors and animal skins and a single rough table. What she saw instead was a great long room with wide pine plank floors swept clean, a massive stone hearth at one end with a fire burning low and red, two stuffed chairs and a carved settle pulled close to the heat, a long oak table with 8 chairs, each chair turned at the same angle, the kind of order that spoke of men who lived alone but did not live like animals. A kitchen at the other end with a black iron cook stove, copper pots hanging from a rack overhead, a barrel of flour, a barrel of cornmeal, strings of dried herbs and onions hanging from the rafters, a staircase climbing one wall to a second floor, and books. Along the wall opposite the hearth from floor to ceiling books, hundreds of them, more books than she had seen anywhere in Copper Creek, more books than were in the Charleston library her father used to take her to as a child. She walked toward the shelves without realizing she was walking. She stopped in front of them. She read the titles in the firelight. Shakespeare, the complete plays in a worn red binding, Walt Whitman, Charles Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, a King James Bible, a Greek New Testament, Homer in translation, and below it, Homer in the original Greek. And on the lowest shelf in a cracked leather binding, a single, small, thick volume that made her breath catch. She crouched down. She touched the spine with one finger. Plutarch's Lives in Latin. She was not aware that she had spoken until she heard her own voice say very quietly, ad astra per aspera. The cabin behind her went still. All three brothers had turned to look at her. Eli, who had been hanging his coat on the peg by the door, stopped with his hand still raised. Jed, who had been kneeling to add a log to the fire, paused with the wad in his hands. Wyatt, who had been carrying her carpet bag toward the foot of the stairs, set the bag down. "Miss Bennet," said Eli Hartwell. His voice was different now, very quiet, very careful. "Did you just speak Latin?" She stood up. She turned around. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. "My father taught me," she said. "He was a preacher, but he had been educated at the seminary in Princeton, and he believed that the language of Caesar was not a thing that should belong only to men. He began my lessons when I was 6 years old. By the time I was 12, I could read Cicero. By the time I was 15, I could read Plutarch in the original. I am sorry, I should not have touched the book without permission." Eli Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room slowly, and he picked up the small, thick volume of Plutarch from the lowest shelf, and he placed it gently into her hands. "That book belonged to my father," he said. "His name was Augustus Hartwell. He was a professor of classical studies at the university in Philadelphia before my mother's lungs forced us to come west. He used to read to us from that book at night when we were boys, the three of us, around a fire just like this one. He has been dead for 18 years, ma'am, and I do not believe anyone besides myself has touched that book since the morning we buried him. You take it. You keep it by your bed. Read it whenever the wind keeps you awake. It will be glad to be read again." Clara May held the small old book against her chest. She did not trust herself to speak. "Wyatt will show you to your room," said Eli Hartwell. "There is a basin and a pitcher of water on the washstand. There are quilts on the bed that my mother made the year before she died. The door has a bolt on the inside, and I want you to use it tonight, not because you have anything to fear from us, but because you have come a long way, and you deserve to sleep without one ear open. We will be downstairs if you need anything. Tomorrow we will talk about what comes next. Tonight, ma'am, you sleep." She nodded. She could not say thank you. She did not have the words. Wyatt picked up her carpet bag and started up the stairs. Clara May followed him, holding the Latin Plutarch against her chest like a shield, and at the top of the stairs she paused and looked back down into the great room. Eli Hartwell was standing where she had left him, in front of the bookshelves, watching her go. The firelight caught the side of his face and the scar through his eyebrow, and the gray that had begun just at the temples to thread through his chestnut hair. He looked for one strange, suspended moment, like a man who had been waiting a very long time for something he had stopped believing would come. Then he turned away, And the moment was gone, and Clara May followed Wyatt down the upstairs hall to the room that would be hers for the next 6 months. The room was small and clean, a narrow bed with a quilt of blue and white squares, a washstand, a small mirror, a single window looking out at the forest where the snow was now falling in the slow, steady way of snow that intended to stay. Wyatt set her carpet bag at the foot of the bed and lit the small oil lamp on the washstand and turned to go. At the door, he paused. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Yes, Wyatt. I am sorry, truly sorry. I did not mean to bring you all this way under false pretenses. But I want you to know something. I read every letter you sent in reply. I read them by this same firelight. And the woman who wrote those letters from was the kind of woman my brother needs, whether he knows it yet or not. And I am not sorry for that part. I will never be sorry for that part." Then he closed the door softly behind him, and Clara May was alone for the first time in 9 days. She set the Plutarch on the washstand. She walked to the door and she slid the bolt across, and the bolt was good, just as Eli had said, heavy iron, the kind of bolt a man builds when he means to keep a promise. She walked back to the bed. She sat down on the edge of it. She looked at her own reflection in the small mirror across the room, and she did not recognize the woman she saw. The woman in the mirror had hollow cheeks and frightened eyes in a navy blue traveling dress gone gray, with the dust of 9 days of trains and one terrible walk through the snow. The woman in the mirror was 22 years old and looked 30. Clara May lay down on the quilt without undressing. She curled onto her side. She pulled one of the heavy wool blankets up over her shoulders. She closed her eyes. And for the first time since she had left Charleston 6 weeks ago, for the first time since her father had died 6 years ago, for the first time and longer than she could honestly remember, Clara May Bennett let herself cry. Not the controlled, silent tears of the woman who had walked into the Silver Spur saloon. Not the 2 tears she had allowed to fall in front of Eli Hartwell. The other kind. The kind that came from a place she had kept locked for years. She cried into the pillow that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, and she cried because she was warm, and because she was safe, and because 3 giant, gentle strangers had carried her up a mountain in the snow and given her a room with a lock and a Latin book that had belonged to a dead professor named Augustus Hartwell. She cried until she was empty, and then she slept. Downstairs in the great room of the cabin, the 3 Hartwell brothers were not sleeping. They sat around the long oak table without speaking. Wyatt had made a fresh pot of coffee. None of them had touched it. The fire had burned down to deep red coals, and the wind outside had risen to a steady moan against the eaves, and the snow against the windows was building up in the corners of the panes. Finally, Jed, the middle brother, the one who had not spoken a word to Clara May the entire ride up the mountain, set down his coffee cup and looked at Eli. "Brother." "Yes, Jed. You know what you just brought into this house?" "I brought a guest, Jed, a guest who would have been dead by morning otherwise. You brought a young woman 2,000 miles from her home who has nowhere to go and nobody to claim her, and you offered her shelter for an entire winter. That is not a guest. That is a beginning, and you know it as well as I do." Eli Hartwell looked at his middle brother. Jed was the one who said the thing the other 2 brothers were thinking. Jed had always been that one. It was both his great gift and his great curse. "I know what it is," Eli said quietly. "I know exactly what it is. And I know what I told her, which is that she has until spring to decide whether she stays or goes, and I will not lay one hand on her in that time, and I will not say one word to her that obligates her to anything. That is the bargain I made. That is the bargain I will keep." "And after spring," said Jed. Eli Hartwell did not answer. Wyatt, the youngest, spoke up softly from his end of the table. "Did you see her face when she touched that Plutarch?" "I saw it," said Eli. "Did you see the way she said the Latin, like she was saying a prayer?" "I saw it, Wyatt. I have been writing letters in your name for 3 months, brother. I have been searching for the kind of woman who could walk into this cabin and not be afraid of what she found here. I read 60 replies before I read hers. 60. And the moment I read her first letter, I knew. I cannot explain it to you. I knew the way you know your own name. And tonight, when she walked through that door and went straight to the bookshelves like a woman coming home to a room she had never seen before, I knew it again. She is the one, Eli. Whatever that means. She is the one. Eli Hartwell put his face in his hands. I am not ready, Wyatt, he said into his palms. I am not ready to be ready. Sarah has been dead 3 years, and I have not learned how to be alive again, and I am scared of what it would mean to Trum. Wyatt looked at his older brother for a tongues. Brother, he said, I think being scared is exactly what it feels like when you are finally ready. The three of them sat in silence. The fire popped. The wind moaned. Somewhere upstairs, the woman they had brought home through the snow was sleeping for the first time in 9 days under a quilt that Eli Hartwell's mother had made before she died. Outside in the great dark forest of Black Pine Hollow, the snow kept falling. It fell on the cabin and on the barn and on the smokehouse and on the iron tracks of the train depot 10 miles down the mountain in Copper Creek. It fell on the rocking chair on the porch and on the wagon Jed had unhitched and on the dark patient horses now warm and dry in their stalls. It fell on the grave of Sarah Hartwell, which lay on a small rise behind the cabin, marked by a single river stone Eli had carved with his own hands. And 3 miles to the south, in a small, dry cave hollowed out of a limestone outcrop, a man in a wide-brimmed hat sat by a small, careful fire and cleaned a Colt revolver with a strip of oiled rag. His name was Silas Crane, and he had ridden 3 days from a railhead in Wyoming Territory on the strength of a telegram from a wealthy older man in Charleston, South Carolina. The telegram had been short. It had said only this: Bennett girl headed to Hartwell Brothers, Copper Creek, Montana. Stop, finish the Hartwell business, and bring her back. Stop double payment if both done by spring. Stop Crane. Silas Crane wiped the last of the oil from the barrel of the Colt. He held the revolver up to the firelight and turned it slowly so the metal caught the orange glow. He smiled just slightly, the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular kind of work and who now had it in front of him, and who was patient enough to enjoy the waiting, because the waiting was the part he liked best. He had been to Black Pine Hollow before. 3 years ago, in the autumn of 1879, he had ridden up the same road Jed Hartwell had just driven a wagon down, and he had stood on the same ridge where Wyatt Hartwell sometimes set his trap lines, and he had watched the same cabin from the cover of the same pines. He had done a particular piece of work that autumn, and he had been paid for it, and he had ridden away believing the matter closed. Now the matter had reopened. Now the matter had a Charleston girl in a navy blue dress walking into the same cabin he had visited once before, and an older brother still alive who had asked too many questions in the years since, and a middle brother who had a temper, and a youngest brother who had seen something on a hilltop one autumn morning 3 years ago that he had never quite been able to forget. Silas Crane slid the revolver into the holster at his hip. He banked his fire. He pulled his coat around him. He lay down with his hat over his eyes and his rifle within reach, and he began to think about the slow, careful, patient way he was going to take Black Pine Hollow apart from the inside, brother by brother, until there was nothing left of the Hartwell name but a girl in a navy blue dress on a southbound train riding home to a man in Charleston who had been waiting 6 weeks to see her face again. The wind moved through the pines. The snow kept falling. And in the cabin at the top of the mountain, Clara May Bennett slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the saved, with a Latin book on her bedside table and a cedar quilt around her shoulders, while 3 brothers sat around a dying fire and tried to understand what had just walked through their door. She did not know yet about the man in the cave. She did not know yet about the woman buried on the rise behind the cabin, or the autumn morning in 1879, when Wyatt Hartwell had seen something on a hilltop that he had never told his eldest brother about. She did not know yet about any of it. She only knew that she was warm and that she was safe, and that for the first time in 6 years, a man had looked at her across the table and seen her really seen her the way her father used to see her when she was a small girl reading Latin by candlelight in a Charleston parsonage before the fever came and took everything she had. The night was long. The mountain was vast. The story was just beginning. Clara May Bennett woke at first light to a world she did not recognize. The window of her small room was fogged at the edges with frost, and through the clear center pane she could see a forest she had never seen before in daylight. The pines stood very still and very tall under a thick coat of fresh snow. The sky beyond them was the pale gray of mother of pearl. Somewhere out in that white silence, a single bird was calling, three notes again and again, the same patient melody. She lay under the cedar quilt for a long moment, and she let her body remember where she was. Montana, the cabin, Eli Hartwell, the Plutarch on the washstand. She sat up. She had slept in her traveling dress because she had not had the strength last night to do otherwise. Her hair had come loose from its pins. She rose and crossed to the small mirror, and she looked at herself, and the woman who looked back at her this morning was not quite the same hollow-eyed creature she had seen the night before. There was still exhaustion in the face, there was still grief, but there was also something else now, something small and steady, something that had not been there yesterday, a kind of returning. She washed her face from the basin. The water was cold enough to make her gasp. She unpinned the rest of her hair and brushed it out and rebraided it into the simple coronet her mother had taught her when she was 9 years old. She straightened the wrinkled navy dress as best she could, and she opened the small carpet bag and took out her one clean apron, a plain gray cotton thing she had brought because her father had told her once that an apron was the badge of a useful woman, and a useful woman was never unwelcome anywhere. She tied it around her waist. She slid the bolt back from the door. Then she went down the stairs. She smelled the coffee before she reached the bottom step. Coffee and bacon and something sweeter, something with cornmeal and molasses. The great room of the cabin was warm and golden in the early light. The fire had been built up. Wyatt Hartwell was at the iron cook stove with his sleeves rolled up to the elbow, a wooden spoon in one hand frying something in a heavy black skillet. He looked up when he heard her on the stair, and his whole face changed. "Miss Bennett, good morning. I did not expect you to be up so early." "My father was a preacher," she said. "Preachers and their daughters do not sleep past dawn. It is a law somewhere in Leviticus, I believe." It was the first joke she had made in 2 years. Wyatt smiled at her. He had a good smile. It was the kindest smile a younger brother gave to a sister he had always wanted and never had. He gestured to the long oak table. "Sit. Coffee is hot. Eli and Najed are out at the barn breaking ice on the trough. They will be in shortly. I am making cornmeal mush with bacon and a little molasses. It is poor man's breakfast, but it sticks to your ribs, and you look like a woman who needs something that sticks." Clara May did not sit. She walked to the cook stove instead, and she stood beside him, and she said very quietly, "Wyatt, I would be obliged if you would let me help. I cannot eat a meal cooked for me by a man whose only sin against me was kindness. Please, give me a task." Wyatt looked at her. He hesitated. Then he handed her the wooden spoon. "Stir," he said. "Slow circles. Keep it moving so it does not stick. I will set the table." She took the spoon. The mush in the skillet was thick and pale gold and steaming. She stirred it the way he had told her, the slow circles, watching the way the cornmeal moved around the wooden spoon, and a small thing happened inside her chest. She had not cooked at a stove that was not Aunt Hester's stove in 6 years. Aunt Hester's stove had been a battlefield. This stove was a kitchen. She heard the cabin door open behind her. She heard the sound of 2 pairs of boots stamping snow off in the entryway. She heard a low murmur of voices. Then she heard Eli Hartwell say very quietly, "Wyatt, is that her at the stove?" "It is, brother." Clara May did not turn around. She kept stirring. Her hand was perfectly steady. She listened to the silence behind her, the silence of 2 men who had walked into their own kitchen and found a small woman in a gray apron stirring their breakfast. And she felt the weight of that silence, and she understood with a quiet certainty that surprised her that something in the cabin had just shifted by a fraction of an inch, and that the shifting wasn't going to stop. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," said Eli Hartwell. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell. You did not have to." "I know I did not have to. That is why I did." He did not answer that. She heard him cross to the wash basin by the door, and she heard the splash of water as he rinsed his hands. When she finally turned from the stove, with the skillet held in both hands and a folded cloth between her palms and the iron handle, all three brothers were standing at the table waiting for her. Eli was at the head of the table. Jed was at his right. Wyatt had set a fourth place at Eli's left. Her place. She set the skillet on the trivet in the middle of the table, and she sat down in the chair Wyatt had set for her, and Eli Hartwell bowed his head, and the three brothers folded their hands, and Clara May folded hers. "Lord," said Eli Hartwell, "we thank you for this food. We thank you for the hands that prepared it. We thank you for the safe passage of our guest who came to us out of the snow last night and who is sitting at this table this morning by no accident of yours. Bless this house. Bless the woman in it. Amen." "Amen," said Wyatt. "Amen," said Jed, and it was the first word she had heard him speak since Copper Creek. "Amen," said Clara May Bennett, and she did not weep, but it was a near thing. They ate. The mush was good. The bacon was salty and crisp. Eli passed her a small jug of cream, and she poured it over the mush, and the cream made small white pools in the gold. She ate slowly the way she had taught herself to eat last night. Wyatt watched her eat with a quiet satisfaction. Jed watched her with the careful sideways watching of a man who had not yet decided what he thought of her. Eli did not watch her at all. Eli ate his own breakfast and looked steadily at his plate, as if looking at her too long might break something he was trying very hard to keep whole. When the meal was finished, she rose and she gathered the plates before any of them could stop her, and she carried them to the wash basin, and she washed them in the hot water Wyatt had set on the stove, and she dried them with a clean cloth, and she set them stacked on the shelf above the basin in the order she had found them. Then she turned and she said, "Mr. Hartwell, I have a request." Eli, who had been watching her now, without being able to stop himself, looked up. "I will not be a guest in this house. I cannot be. It is not in me. If I am to live under your roof for a winter, I must work for the privilege. Tell me what needs doing. Bread mending, cleaning hauling, water churning, candle making. Tell me what your mother used to do in this cabin, and I will do it. I do not ask to be paid. I ask only to be useful. Useful is the only currency I have left, and I will spend it freely, or I will not stay." Eli Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. "Wyatt," he said, without taking his eyes from her arm, "tomorrow morning you will show Miss Bennet the larder. You will show her the barrel of flour and the barrel of cornmeal and the smokehouse and the root cellar. You will show her the herbs in the rafters and the way the stove damper works. You will answer every question she asks you. After tomorrow, this kitchen is hers until such time as she chooses otherwise. Is that understood?" "Yes, brother." "Miss Bennet." "Yes, Mr. Hartwell. In this house, we do not speak of charity. We speak of work. You have asked for work. Work is yours." Clara May nodded once, and she turned back to the basin to hide her face because something in the way he had said it had filled her eyes again, and she did not want him to see. The first week passed. She learned the rhythm of the cabin. She learned that Eli rose before dawn and was at the barn within 10 minutes of waking, and that Jed followed him a quarter hour later, and that Wyatt was always the first one in the kitchen and the last one to bed, because Wyatt was the one who carried the small daily care of the household on his back, without ever calling it that. She learned that the coffee pot was kept on the back of the stove all day long, and that the men would come in from the cold 3 or 4 times in a morning to pour themselves a cup and warm their hands before going back out. She learned that Eli took his coffee, black and bitter, that Jed took his black with 2 fingers of cream when there was cream, and that Wyatt took a small spoonful of molasses in his because his teeth had a sweet tooth he was ashamed of. She learned the larder. She learned the smokehouse with its hanging hams and venison shoulders and slabs of bacon. She learned the root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin where the potatoes and turnips and carrots and onions lay packed in straw. She learned that the herbs in the rafters had been hung there by Wyatt, who had a knowledge of plants she had not expected from a mountain man, and that he would pull down a sprig of yarrow or mullein or willow bark and crush it between his fingers and tell her what each one did with the patience of a man who had taught himself everything he knew from a single old book his father had owned. And she learned the mending basket. The mending basket was a battlefield. It sat by the fire in the great room, and it was overflowing with shirts that needed cuffs, trousers that needed knees, socks that needed heels, a wool coat with a torn pocket, a linen sheet with a long frayed tear. None of the brothers had touched it in months. Clara May took it on the second night, and she sat by the fire after supper, and she opened the small wooden sewing kit her mother had left her, and she began to mend. She mended a shirt of Eli's first. It was a heavy gray flannel with a frayed cuff and a missing button. She replaced the button with one from her own kit. She rebuilt the cuff with stitches so small and even they were almost invisible. She held the shirt up to the firelight when she was finished, and she examined her own work, and she felt for the first time in 6 years the small, honest pride of a thing well done. She set the shirt on the back of Eli's chair before she went up to bed. The next morning he found it. He picked it up. He examined the cuff in the morning light. He stood for a long moment at the foot of the stairs holding that gray flannel shirt with both hands, and Wyatt, who saw the whole thing from the kitchen, would later tell Clara May that he had not seen his older brother's face look like that in 3 full years. The second week began with snow. A great storm came in from the northwest and pinned the cabin under it for 4 days. The wind shook the eaves. Boys saved the surrounding palms. The horses in the barn stamped and whinnied, and Jed went out 3 times a day to bring them oats and break the ice on their water trough. Eli and Wyatt brought in armload after armload of split firewood from the lean-to and stacked it by the great hearth until the stack was as tall as Clara May herself. The cabin grew warm and close and smelled of pine smoke and coffee and bread baking because Clara May was baking now every day 2 loaves of bread from the barrel of flour and a pan of cornbread besides. And the men ate it as fast as she could make it, and Wyatt told her on the 3rd day very seriously that he had not eaten bread this good since his mother died. In the long evenings of the storm, the 4 of them sat in the great room together. Eli would sit in the carved settle nearest the fire with a thick book of accounts on his knees working through the winter ledger. Jed would sit cross-legged on the rug cleaning his rifles, 3 of them in a row, with a small cloth and a bottle of oil. Wyatt would mend snowshoes or sharpen an axe or weave a small basket from strips of black ash he had cured the autumn before. And Clara May would sit in the chair across from Eli with her sewing in her lap, or with a small cracked Latin Plutarch open across her knees reading the lives of dead Romans by firelight. On the 3rd evening of the storm, she began to read aloud. She had not meant to. She had been reading the life of Cato the Younger, and she had come to a passage so beautifully written that she had whispered it to herself in Latin without thinking. And Eli Hartwell, sitting 6 feet away with his ledger forgotten, had said very quietly, "Read it aloud, ma'am, if you would. The Latin first, then the English." So she read. She read in the soft, careful Latin her father had taught her in the parsonage in Charleston when she was 10 years old, the long, rolling sentences of Plutarch's Greek translated into the Latin of a Renaissance scholar. And then she read it again in her own slow English, translating as she went. The fire popped. The wind moaned at the eaves. Jed had stopped cleaning his rifle. Wyatt had set down onto the basket he was weaving. All 3 brothers were listening to her with the still attention of men who had not been read to since their father had died, and Clara May read on the Latin, and then the English, the Latin, and then the English until her voice grew tired, and she closed the book gently and looked up. Eli Hartwell was looking at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a sunrise after a long night when he had not been sure the sun would rise at all. He was looking at her with an expression so naked that she was not sure he knew his face was making it. And then he caught himself, and he looked down at the ledger in his lap, and he said in a voice that did not quite belong to him, "Thank you, Miss Bennett. That was the finest hour I have spent in this room in 3 years." Clara May did not answer. She did not trust her voice. She rose and she set the Plutarch on the small table beside her chair, and she said goodnight, and she went up the stairs to her room. That night, for the first time, she did not slide the bolt across the door. She did not know why she did not slide it. She only knew that the bolt was no longer necessary. The lock that had been keeping her safe these past 2 weeks had not been the iron bolt on the door. It had been the word of Eli Hartwell, given freely on a snowy night in a saloon in Copper Creek. And that word was a thing more solid than iron. And she trusted it now the way she had once trusted her father's hand on her shoulder when she was a child. The third week brought the woodlot. Eli came in from the barn one morning with an axe in his hand and a question on his face. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with the axe head resting on the floor between his boots, and he looked at Clara May, who was kneading bread dough on the oak table, and he said, "Miss Bennett, have you ever held an axe?" "No, Mr. Hartwell, I have not." "Would you like to learn?" She looked up from the dough. Flour was on her cheek. Her sleeves were pushed up to the elbow. She considered the question. "Yes," she said, "I would." So that afternoon, when the bread was rising under a clean cloth and the stew for supper was simmering on the back of the stove, Eli Hartwell took her out behind the barn to the chopping block, and he handed her the smallest of the household axes, and he taught her to split kindling. He did not stand close to her. He kept a careful arm's length, the same careful arm's length he had kept since the night he had lifted her down from the wagon. He stood beside the chopping block with his own hands tucked into the pockets of his deer-hide coat, and he taught her with words. "Feet shoulder width apart, ma'am. A little wider than that. Good. Now grip the haft of the axe with your strong hand near the head and your weak hand near the butt. As the axe comes down, your strong hand slides toward your weak hand. That is where the speed comes from. Not from the shoulders, from the slide. Try." She tried. The axe head hit the chopping block at an angle, and the small piece of pine she had been aiming at flew sideways into the snow. "Pick it up," said Eli. "Try again." She picked it up. She tried again. The axe glanced off the wood and bit into the chopping block. Again. She tried again, and again, and again. Her arms began to ache. Her face grew warm despite the cold. A piece of hair came loose from her braid and stuck to her forehead with sweat. Eli Hartwell stood beside the block with his hands in his pockets, and he did not laugh at her, and he did not correct her, and he only said after every attempt the same single word. Again. On the 11th try, the axe came down clean. The small piece of pine split neatly in two and fell on either side of the chopping block in two perfect halves. Clara May stood very still. She looked at the two halves, then she looked up at Eli Hartwell, and her face was flushed with blood and effort, and her eyes were shining, and she said, "Mr. Hartwell, I split it." "You split it, ma'am." "I split it." "Yes, ma'am, you did." A small, slow smile began at the corner of Eli Hartwell's mouth. It moved across his face like the first line of dawn moving across a dark valley, and Clara May watched it happen. And she understood that she was seeing something his brothers had not seen in 3 years, and she would remember the smile for the rest of her life. That same evening after supper, Clara May climbed the stairs to her room with the intention of finding a fresh handkerchief in her carpetbag. She paused on the landing. The door at the end of the hall, the door to the small attic stair, was standing slightly open. She had not opened it. She had never been up the attic stair. The door was always closed. She went to the door. She put her hand on the cold iron latch. She listened. Below her in the great room, she could hear the low murmur of the brothers talking. Eli was reading something aloud from the ledger. Wyatt was answering. Jed was silent, as he often was. They would not come up. She told herself she would only look. She told herself she was only curious about the layout of the cabin she now lived in. She told herself a great many small, honest lies the way human beings do. And she pushed the attic door open, and she went up the narrow stair. The attic was small and cold and smelled of cedar. The ceiling sloped down on both sides to the eaves. There was a single, small dormer window covered in frost. Trunks were stacked along one wall. Old furniture was draped in white sheets along the other. Dust lay over everything in a soft gray blanket. She moved between the trunks. Her lamp threw long, moving shadows across the rafters. She told herself again that she was only looking, that she would not open anything, that she was only curious about the size of the space. Then she saw the cedar trunk. It was set apart from the others. It was not stacked. It sat alone in the dormer window's frostlight, and a piece of folded white linen lay across the lid as if to keep dust off something cared for. The cedar was honey-colored. The hinges were brass. The lock was unlocked. She set her lamp down on the floor. She knelt in front of the trunk. She lifted the linen aside. She opened the lid. Inside, folded with the care of someone who had loved, the folding lay a wedding dress. White muslin with small white flowers embroidered along the hem, yellowed now with the years. A pair of small, cream-colored kid leather slippers beside it. A pressed sprig of mountain heather between two pages of wax paper. A single dark brown braid of hair tied at both ends with pale blue ribbon, and underneath all of it, a small leather-bound book. A diary. The cover was the deep dark red of dried roses, and underneath the diary, a daguerreotype in a small brass frame. Clara May lifted the daguerreotype out with hands that had begun to shake, though she could not have said why they were shaking. She tilted it toward the lamp. A young man and a young woman stood under the wide, spreading branches of an apple tree in summer. The young man was tall and broad-shouldered, and his hair was thick and chestnut, and his face was unmarked by years or grief. His arm was around the young woman's waist. The young woman had dark brown hair pinned up in a soft knot, and a wide, warm mouth, and eyes that even in the gray and silver of an old daguerreotype were full of joy. She was leaning into him as if she belonged there. He was looking down at her as if she were the only thing in the world. Clara May turned the picture over. On the back, in a careful preacher's hand, much like her father's, was written, Sarah Wells Hartwell and Elijah Augustus Hartwell, June the 15th, 1879. Married this day under the apple tree at Black Pine Hollow by Reverend Thaddeus Green of Helena. She stared at the picture for a long time. Sarah, the wife who had died 3 years ago. The wife Eli Hartwell had said on the night he brought her up the mountain that he had failed to keep safe. Clara May did not weep. She had thought she might. But what rose in her instead, slow and quiet and surprising, was not jealousy and not grief, but a strange, clean recognition. She looked at the face of Sarah Wells Hartwell, and Sarah's face looked back at her across 3 years of mountain dark, and Clara May understood suddenly and completely that she was not in competition with this woman. She was in conversation with her. She set the daguerreotype back into the trunk, very gently. She did not open the diary. Some doors a guest does not open even when they are unlocked. She closed the lid. She refolded the linen across the top exactly as she had found it. She picked up her lamp. Then, standing alone in the cold attic, she said aloud very quietly to a woman who had been dead 3 years and could not hear her, Sarah, I am sorry I came up here. I am sorry I touched what was yours. I want you to know that I am not here to take anything from you. I am only here for one winter. He still belongs to you. I see that he still belongs to you. Whatever I can be for him while I am under this roof, I will be, but I will never ask him to forget. I promise you that. From one woman to another, I promise. She went back down the attic stairs. She closed the door behind her. She returned to her room and she lay down on the bed without undressing, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time before she finally slept. The 4th week brought the note on the fence post. Jed found it. He came in from running the trap line on the ridge above the cabin in the middle of the morning, and his face was the color of old ash. And he laid a folded piece of paper on the oak table in front of Eli Hartwell without a word. The paper had been pinned to a fence post on the north line by a small bone-handled knife. The knife was now in Jed's coat pocket. Jed did not know whose knife it was. He had never seen it before in his life. Eli unfolded the paper. The handwriting was bad, the kind of bad that comes from a man who can write but does not read for pleasure. The note said this: "Send the Charleston girl back south or I will come and take her myself. A friend of Hester Bennett." Eli read it twice. He folded it once. He looked up at Clara May, who was at the kitchen table rolling out biscuit dough, and his face was so calm that she knew at once that something terrible had just walked into the cabin. "Miss Bennett, sit down. I have to tell you something." She sat. He set the note in front of her. She read it. Her face went the color of the biscuit dough. "Aunt Hester," she said. "She would not. She does not have the money. She does not know anyone in Montana." "Tell me about her," said Eli Hartwell. "Tell me everything, the full story, from the beginning. Everything you have not told us yet, now." So Clara May told them. She told them about her father, the Reverend Thomas Bennett, who had died of yellow fever in the Charleston epidemic of 1876 when she was 16. She told them about her mother, Margaret Bennett, who had died of the same fever 3 weeks later. She told them about the funeral in the small, empty parsonage and the way the deacons of the church had divided up her father's library among themselves and left her with nothing but the Bible and the Plutarch, which her father had once told her would be hers if anything ever happened to him. She told them about Aunt Hester Bennett, her father's older sister, who had taken her in not out of love, but out of duty, and who had given her a narrow bed in an unheated room and 3 meals a day and 6 years of unpaid labor in exchange. She told them about scrubbing floors and hauling water and washing the linens of Aunt Hester's boarders, and about the calluses that had grown on the hands that had once played the small pump organ in her father's church. And then she told them about Mortimer Crane. Mortimer Crane was a Charleston liquor merchant, 61 years old, 3 times a widower. He had begun visiting Aunt Hester's parlor in the summer of this year. He had begun looking at Clara May over Aunt Hester's china teacups in a way that made her stomach turn over. In September, Aunt Hester had called her into the parlor and informed her with the satisfied air of a woman closing a profitable transaction that Mortimer Crane had asked for her hand and that the wedding would be the second Sunday of November, and that Clara May should be grateful to a man of substance for taking an orphan with no dowry off her aunt's hands. Clara May had gone up to her narrow, unheated room, and she had knelt by her and she had prayed for any other road, any road at all. And the next morning, opening her father's old Bible to find comfort, she had found a folded clipping from a paper called the Matrimonial Times pressed between the pages of the Gospel of Luke. The clipping had been marked with a small, careful cross in her father's own faded ink. It was an advertisement from 3 brothers in Montana Territory looking for a Christian woman of good character and learning to share their hearth. Clara May did not know how or when her father had clipped that advertisement, or why he had marked it, or how long it had been waiting in the Bible for her to find. She only knew that her father had known somehow that one day she would need a road and that he had left her one. She had answered the advertisement that same night. The reply in Eli's name, but in Wyatt's hand, had come 3 weeks later with a train ticket inside. She had left Charleston without telling Aunt Hester goodbye. She had left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Only I am going to make my own way. Forgive me, Clara May." When she finished telling the story, the cabin was very quiet. Jed had gone to the window and was staring out at the snow with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Wyatt was looking at her with eyes full of a tenderness that hurt to receive. Eli Hartwell had not moved. He was looking at the note on the table. "This was not written by Hester Bennett," he said quietly. "Hester Bennett does not pay men to ride to Montana. Hester Bennett is a small, mean woman who lost her free maid and went on with her life. This was written by Mortimer Crane." Clara May nodded slowly. The same conclusion had been forming in her own mind. He is a vain man, she said. I shamed him when I left. He is the kind of man who would not let that go. He is more than vain, said Eli. A man does not hire a tracker and send him 2,000 miles for vanity alone. There is something else. There is something he wants beyond you. There is nothing else, said Clara May. I have nothing. Eli Hartwell looked at the note in his hand. Then he looked at his middle brother, who was still staring out the window with the kind of stillness that meant the storm was inside him, not outside. Jed. Yes, brother. From this hour forward, no one in this house goes anywhere alone. Not the trap line, not the woodlot, not the spring, not the barn after dark. Wyatt does not run his lines unless one of us is with him. I do not ride down to Copper Creek alone. And Miss Bennett does not step off this porch without one of the three of us at her elbow. Is that understood? Understood. Wyatt. Yes, Eli. Bring down the long rifles, all four. I want one by the front door, one by the back, one in the loft window, and one at the head of my bed. Loaded, capped, ready. Yes, brother. Miss Bennett. She lifted ear. He was looking at her now without any of the careful distance of the last 3 weeks. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something precious. He has been entrusted with something he will not lose twice in one lifetime. I made you a promise in Copper Creek. I told you that under this roof no man would harm you. I am extending that promise now, not just under this roof, anywhere. As long as you are in these mountains, as long as you are within riding distance of Black Pine Hollow, no harm will come to you from any man living, because any man who tries will have to come through me and through Jed and through Wyatt, and Mr. Crane down in Charleston has not lived long enough to know what those three things together mean. Do you believe me when I tell you this? Clara May Bennett looked into the whiskey-colored eyes of Eli Hartwell. I believe you, she said. Good. Then we are agreed. He stood up. He folded the note. He put it in the inside pocket of his shirt against his heart, and Clara May understood that he was going to carry that note there until the man who had written it was either in chains or in the ground. She did not feel afraid of that. She felt something else. She felt a slow, strange warmth begin somewhere under her ribs. The kind of warmth a woman feels when she discovers, perhaps for the first time in her life, that someone has decided to stand between her and the world. That night, the storm came back. It came down off the Bitterroot Range in the middle of the night, and it shook the cabin like a great hand. The wind howled at the eaves. Snow blew sideways past the windows in long white sheets. Clara May could not sleep. She lay in her bed and listened to the storm, and her thoughts circled and circled around the small, bone-handled knife in the badly written note in the face of Mortimer Crane in Aunt Hester's parlor. At last, she gave up on sleep. She wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders over her nightdress, and she took up her small lamp and she opened the door of her room. The hall was dark. The cabin below was dark except for the deep red glow of the banked fire in the great hearth. She went down the stairs in her stocking feet very quietly. Eli Hartwell was sitting in the carved settle by the fire. He was fully dressed. A long rifle lay across his knees. He was not reading. He was not sleeping. He was watching the door. He looked up when she came down the last step. He did not seem surprised to see her. Could not sleep, Miss Bennett. No, Mr. Hartwell. Could you? No, ma'am. She crossed to the hearth and she sat down in the chair across from him. The fire was warm on her face. The wind moaned outside. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They sat in the deep red firelight and they listened to the storm together, and there was a kind of company in the silence that was better than any words she could have offered him. After a while, he said very quietly, looking at the fire and not at her, Miss Bennett, yes. I owe you an apology. For what? For dragging you into all of this. The note, the man on the ridge, whatever is coming. When you walked into the Silver Spur Saloon last night, the right thing to do would have been to put you in a wagon to Helena the next morning and put $100 in your hand and send you back east to a city where men like Mortimer Crane do not hire trackers. But I did not do that. I asked you to come home with us. I told myself it was because you would freeze. And that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that for the first time in 3 years, this cabin did not feel like a tomb when you walked into it. And I was selfish. I wanted you to stay. And now you are in danger because of my selfishness. And I do not know how to forgive myself for that. Clara May looked at him across the firelight. She looked at the gray at his temples and the thin, pale scar through his eyebrow and the shoulders bowed under the long rifle, and she thought about a young man in a daguerreotype standing under an apple tree with his arm around a wife who was now buried on the rise behind the house. And she thought about a Charleston parsonage and a Bible with a clipping pressed between the pages of Luke. And she thought about how she had walked 2,500 miles to find a husband who did not exist, and had instead found a man who was sitting up alone in the dark with a rifle across his knees because he could not bear the thought of her being harmed. She reached across the small space between their chairs. She put her hand on his hand. His hand was huge and rough and warm. He went very still. He did not pull away. He did not move at all. He looked down at the place where her small white hand rested on the back of his great scarred one, and Clara May watched his face in the firelight, and she saw something move behind his eyes that she did not have a name for, and she did not need a name for it. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Yes, Miss Bennet. I came 2,500 miles to a man who did not write a letter. I am very glad to have come." He did not answer in words. He turned his hand over slowly, the way a man might turn a page in a book he was afraid of tearing, and he closed his fingers gently around hers, and he held her hand in his by the dying fire, while the wind moaned at the eaves of the cabin, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking. When she finally rose to go back to her room, neither of them said goodnight. There was no need. Some things are better not named in the moment they happen because the naming makes them smaller than they are. She climbed the stairs in the dark. She lay down on the cedar quilt. She closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, Clara May Bennet went to sleep with the knowledge that somewhere in the same house, a man was sitting awake by a dying fire with a rifle across his knees, and that he was sitting there because of her, and that she was in some quiet new way she did not yet fully understand, no longer alone in the world. 3 miles south, in a small, dry cave hollowed out of a limestone outcrop, a man named Silas Crane lay awake in his bedroll and listened to the same storm. He had been watching the cabin for 4 days now, from a high ridge to the southwest, and he had counted the brothers and the woman, and he had noted the pattern of the chores and the timing of the trap lines, and he had begun to make a list in the careful small handwriting of a man who took his work seriously. The list had 4 names on it. 3 of them had a small mark next to them already. The 4th one was the woman's name. The woman's name had no mark beside it yet. It only had 2 words written after it in the same small, careful hand. Last. Alive. The morning Wyatt Hartwell did not come home was a clear morning. That was the part Clara May would remember for the rest of her life. Not the storms of the days before, not the long dark of the days after. The morning itself was clear. The sky over the Bitterroot Range was a high, cold blue, the kind of blue you only saw in Montana in the deep heart of winter, and the sun had come up over the eastern ridge with a thin, pale light that made the snow on the pines glitter like crushed glass. It was the kind of morning that made a person believe nothing bad could possibly happen. Wyatt had gone out to check the trap line on the south slope at first light. He had taken his rifle the way Eli had ordered, and he had told Clara May as he pulled on his deer hide coat at the door that he would be back by noon, and that he expected her to have a pot of coffee waiting and a slice of the molasses bread she had baked the day before. He had smiled at her. He had touched the brim of his hat. He had stepped out onto the porch and gone down the steps, and the snow had crunched under his boots, and the door had closed behind him. Noon came and went. Clara May did not say anything at first. She set the table for the midday meal, and she put the coffee on the back of the stove, and she sliced the molasses bread, and she covered it with a clean cloth to keep it warm. Eli came in from the barn at 12:15. Jed came in at 12:20. The two of them sat down at the long oak table, and they took off their hats, and they looked at the empty fourth chair, and they looked at the door, and Eli Hartwell did not pick up his fork. "What time did he leave?" he said. "Just after sunup. He said he would be back by noon." Eli stood up from the table. He had not eaten a bite. He went to the wall by the door, and he took down his long rifle and his coat and his hat in 3 smooth motions, and Jed was already moving, and Clara May was on her feet, though she did not remember standing up. "I am going with you," she said. "You are not, ma'am. You are staying in this cabin with the door bolted and the loft rifle loaded and the window shutters closed. Jed and I will find him. He has probably caught a fox in a leg trap and is having trouble freeing it. He has probably broken a snowshoe and is walking back slow. He has probably stopped at the South Spring to water the dog and lost track of the time. There are 100 reasons a man is late on a trap line, Miss Bennett, and 99 of them are not what you are thinking. Stay here. Do as I ask, please." She did not argue. She nodded once. She watched the two brothers go out the door and down the porch steps and across the snow toward the south slope. And she watched until they disappeared into the trees, and then she closed the cabin door, and she slid the great iron bolt across, and she went to the window by the hearth, and she sat down to wait. She waited 2 hours. In those 2 hours, she did not move from the window. She did not pick up her sewing. She did not pick up the Plutarch. She did not reach for the coffee pot. She sat in the carved chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the snow and the trees, and she prayed, and she was not certain anymore which God she was praying to, only that her father had taught her once that God listened to a frightened heart, whether the heart called him by the right name or not. At 2:30 in the afternoon, she saw a movement at the tree line. She was on her feet before she understood what she was seeing. She ran to the door, and she threw the bolt back, and she pulled the door open, and the cold rushed in over her like water, and she saw Jed Hartwell coming up the path through the snow with his brother in his arms. Wyatt was hanging in his middle brother's grip the way a sack of grain hangs from the shoulder of a man carrying it home. His head had fallen back against Jed's chest. His arms swung loose. The front of his deer hide coat was wet and dark, and the dark had spread down across his trousers and was dripping in slow, heavy drops onto the snow with every step Jed took. Eli walked behind them with both rifles slung over his shoulders, and his face the color of new lead. Clara May did not scream. She would think about that later. She did not scream. Some part of her, some part that had been waiting in the back of her since the night her father died, simply stepped forward and took control of her body. She ran out into the snow in her stocking feet, and she met them at the bottom of the porch steps, and she said to Jed in a voice she had never used before, "Bring him to the long table now. Eli, build up the fire as hot as it will go. Strip the tablecloth. I need boiling water. I need every clean cloth in this house. I need the whiskey from the high shelf. I need my sewing kit. I need it now." They obeyed her. Two men twice her size in their own house, and they obeyed her without a single word because the voice she had used was not the voice of a guest, but the voice of a woman who had once watched her father bury parishioners after the yellow fever and had learned before she was 16 that there were times when somebody had to be in charge, and the only question was who. They laid Wyatt on the long oak table. Clara May cut his coat open with the scissors from her sewing kit. The wound was high on the left side of his belly, just below the ribs. The bullet had gone in clean and had not come out. The bleeding was steady, but not the bright red of an artery. She pressed both her hands over the hole, and she leaned her weight on it, and she said without looking up, "Jed, hold his shoulders. Eli, hold his legs. He is going to wake up when I begin, and he is going to fight me. Do not let him move." The water came to a boil on the stove. She washed her hands. She washed the wound with the boiling water, cooled in a tin basin, and then with the whiskey from the high shelf. Wyatt did wake up. He came up off the table with a hoarse cry that did not sound like him at all, and Jed leaned his full weight on his brother's shoulders, and Eli leaned his full weight on his brother's legs, and Clara May took the smallest knife from her sewing kit, and she sterilized the blade in the flame of the lamp, and she went looking for the bullet. She found it in her third pass. It was lodged against the lower ribs, and it had not punctured anything she could see. She worked it out slowly the way her father had taught her once, when they were dressing a wound on a fisherman in the parsonage kitchen. During the war, slow and steady, do not panic. The bullet wants to come out as much as you want to take it out. You just have to invite it. She held it up in the lamplight when it was free. A flat lump of soft lead scored across the front with a small, careful X. Eli Hartwell looked at the X on the bullet and his face changed. "What is it?" she said. "It is a marked round. A man who scores his bullets is a man who keeps count of his kills. This was not a stray shot from a hunter. This was a man who came up here on purpose, who took the shot on purpose, and who counted my brother as the third Hartwell on his list." Clara May kept working. There was time later for what the bullet meant. Now there was a wound to close. She threaded a needle from her sewing kit with silk thread, and she sterilized it in the lamp flame, and she sewed Wyatt Hartwell's belly closed with the same small even stitches she had used to mend the cuff of Eli's gray flannel shirt 3 weeks before. When she was finished, she packed the wound with a crushed yarrow Wyatt himself had taught her about, and she bandaged it with a strip of clean linen torn from her own petticoat, and she sat down very suddenly on the bench beside the table because her legs would not hold her any longer. Eli Hartwell put his hand on her shoulder. He did not say anything. The hand on her shoulder said everything that needed saying. That night they moved Wyatt to the carved settle by the fire so the heat could reach him. Clara May did not leave his side. She sat on a low stool beside him, and she held his hand, and she watched his face, and the fever began to climb in him after midnight, and by 2 in the morning he was burning, and by 4 in the morning he was talking to people who were not in the room. It was at 4:30 in the morning that he began to talk about Sarah. Eli was in the carved settle across from his brother, half asleep, his rifle across his knees, his head fallen forward onto his chest. Jed was at the front window with another rifle watching the dark. Clara May was the only one fully awake when Wyatt's hand tightened around hers and his eyes opened, and he looked straight up at the rafters, and he said in a voice that was not quite his own, Sarah, I am sorry. I should have told him. I saw the man on the ridge that morning. I thought he was a hunter. I thought he was just a hunter. Sarah, forgive me. Sarah." Clara May went very still. She looked across the room at Eli. He was still half asleep. He had not heard. She looked at Jed at the window. Jed had heard. Jed had turned slowly from the window, and he was looking at his brother on the settle with a face she could not read. Wyatt's eyes closed again. The fever was dragging him back under, but his hands stayed tight around Clara May's, and his lips kept moving, and the words kept spilling out of him in the small broken whisper of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years and could no longer carry it alone. "I saw him on the ridge. Tall man, wide-brimmed hat. He was looking down at the cabin, the old cabin. I thought he was a hunter, Sarah. I waved at him. He did not wave back. I did not tell anyone. 2 hours later, the cabin was burning. 2 hours, Sarah. I could have warned you. I could have warned Eli. I did not warn anyone. I did not warn anyone." The fever broke at dawn. Wyatt fell into a deep, clean sleep, and his face cooled, and the bleeding from the wound did not start again. Clara May rose from the stool by the settle, and she walked stiffly to the kitchen, and she poured cold coffee into a tin cup, and she drank it standing up. Her back ached. Her hands ached. Her eyes burned. She had been awake for 24 hours. Jed Hartwell came to stand beside her at the kitchen counter. "You heard him," she said quietly. "I heard him. Eli does not know. Eli does not know. He needs to know." Jed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, he does, but he should hear it from his brother, Miss Bennett. Not from me, Sven, not from you, from Wyatt's own mouth when Wyatt is strong enough to speak the words." Will you wait? Will you hold this with me for 1 or 2 days, just until Wyatt can carry it himself? Eli will need to hear it from the brother who saw it, not from the people who overheard it in fever. Clara May nodded slowly. I will wait. It took 3 days. On the morning of the third day, Wyatt was strong enough to sit up in the settle and take a cup of broth, and his eyes were clear. And Clara May sat down beside him, and she took his hand, and she said very gently, Wyatt, when the fever was on you, you spoke about Sarah. You spoke about a man on a ridge. You have been carrying something for 3 years. It is time to set it down. Eli is here. Jed is here. We are all here. Tell him. Wyatt's eyes filled with tears. He told it. He told it slowly in a voice that broke over and over, and that he had to drag back together each time. He told about the autumn morning in 1879. He told about going out to set a beaver trap on the creek and about climbing the South Ridge to look down at the old cabin where Eli and Sarah had lived in the first year of their marriage. The small first cabin Eli had built with his own hands before they had built the bigger cabin on the higher ground. He told about seeing the tall man in the wide-brimmed hat standing on the opposite ridge, watching the small cabin where Sarah was hanging out the wash. He told about waving and getting no wave back. He told about thinking the man was a hunter. He told about going on with his trap. He told about the column of black smoke he had seen rising from the valley 2 hours later, and the run back through the woods and the cabin already collapsed and burning when he reached it, and the way Eli had come up from the south pasture too late, too late, too late, and the way Eli had walked into the flames anyway and brought Sarah out wrapped in his own coat, and the way Sarah had not been breathing when he laid her in the snow. Wyatt told it all weeping, and when he had finished, he said, I never told you, brother. For 3 years, I never told you. I told myself it could not have been the man on the ridge. I told myself it was just a stove fire that got out of hand. I told myself anything I had to tell myself to keep from looking at you across this table and seeing what I should have seen. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I should have told you the day it happened. Eli Hartwell sat very still. The cabin was so quiet, Clara May could hear the small ticking of cooling iron in the cook stove on the other side of the room. The fire popped once. Outside, a soft new snow had begun to fall against the windows. Eli did not move. He looked at his youngest brother with an expression that was not anger and not grief and not anything she could put a name to. It was the face of a man who had been told 3 years too late that the worst thing that had ever happened to him had not been an accident. Eli stood up. He walked to his brother on the settle. He bent down and he put both his great scarred hands on either side of Wyatt's face the way a father holds the face of a small son, and he pressed his forehead to his brother's forehead, and he said in a voice so quiet that Clara May almost did not hear it, Wyatt, listen to me. I have loved you every day of your life. I will love you every day of mine. There is nothing in what you just told me that changes that by 1 inch. You were a bae that morning. You did what a boy does. You saw a hunter. You waved. You went on with your work. You did not know. Do you hear me? You did not know. The man who set that fire is the man who killed Sarah. Not you, never you. You hear me, brother. Wyatt was sobbing now. He could not answer. He could only nod against his brother's forehead. Eli held him like that for a long minute. Then he straightened. He turned. He walked to the door. He took his coat from the peg, and he put it on slowly, and he picked up his rifle, and he stepped out onto the porch into the falling snow. Clara May followed him. She did not put on her shawl. She did not put on her boots. She walked out onto the porch in her stocking feet, and she stood beside him at the porch rail. The snow was falling soft and slow over the black trees. He was not crying. He was looking out at the trees, and his face was very still, and his hands on the porch rail were perfectly steady. Eli. Yes, Clara May. It was the first time he had called her by her name without the miss in front of it. She felt the change of it like a small, warm hand on her chest. What are you going to do? He did not answer for a long time. Then he said, I am going to find the man with the wide-brimmed hat. I am going to find him whether he is the same man who is hiding on my mountain right now, or whether he is some other man. I am going to find him, and I am going to ask him 3 questions. I am going to ask him if he killed my wife. I am going to ask him who paid him. And then I am going to do whatever the answer makes me do. She put her hand on his hand on the porch rail. Eli, listen to me. There is no one else for me. Do you understand what I am telling you? There is no one in Charleston. There is no one in Helena. There is no one anywhere on this earth who is waiting for me except the 3 of you in this cabin. If you ride out alone to find this man, and you do not come back, you do not just leave a mountain without an eldest brother. You leave a woman without the only place she has ever called home. I am asking you, do not ride alone. Eli Hartwell turned his head and he looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the same look he had given her in the firelight 3 weeks ago. The look of a man who had stopped believing the sun would rise and was now seeing it rise. And then he said very quietly, Clara May, if I come back from this, if God grants me that I am going to ask you a question, I am not going to ask it now because the asking of it is too important to be tangled up with what I am about to do. But I want you to know that I am going to ask it. Will you wait for the asking? I will wait, she said. He nodded once, he turned and he went back inside. That night, the man with the wide-brimmed hat made the choice for them. Sheriff Cyrus Brody of Copper Creek rode up the mountain through the falling snow at sunset. He arrived at the cabin alone on a tired horse, and Eli met him at the door with a rifle in his hand and brought him into the fire. Brody was a man Eli had known since he was a boy. Brody had served under Eli's father in the war. Brody was the kind of lawman who knew the difference between the law as it was written and the law as it ought to be, and who tried most days to find the second one inside the first. He took the cup of coffee Clara May handed him. He warmed his hands at the fire. Then he said, Eli, I have news. I have been turning it over for 2 days trying to decide how to bring it to you, and I decided this morning I had to bring it in person. Tell it, Cyrus. There is a man in Copper Creek. He has been there for 9 days now. He came in on the train from the Wyoming railhead. He registered at the boarding house under the name John Smith, and he paid in $20 gold pieces, which is the kind of thing a deputy notices. I had a deputy follow him for 2 days. He goes out before light every morning, and he comes back after dark every night. He carries a Colt revolver and a Sharps rifle. He never speaks to anyone in town except to order food. And he has been asking quiet questions in the saloon about the Hartwell place and about a young woman from Charleston who came in on the November train. Eli said nothing. His hand on his coffee cup did not move. That is not all. I sent a wire down to Denver. I have a friend in the marshal's office there. I asked him to run the description. The wire came back yesterday. The man's real name is Silas Crane. He is a tracker for hire out of Denver. He is wanted in 2 territories on suspicion of arson and 1 count of murder for hire. Eli. Brody set down his cup and looked his old friend in the eye. Crane was in this district in the autumn of '79. The marshal's office has him on a job that ended the 2nd week of October that year. The job was paid for by an unnamed party out of a Charleston bank. I am not telling you anything you cannot work out for yourself, but I am telling you so the working out does not happen alone. Eli Hartwell sat very still. Clara May watched his face. She watched the muscle along his jaw move once and once again, and then go still. And the unnamed Charleston party, Eli said, I cannot prove it yet, but the wire said the bank was the Carolina Mercantile and Trust, and the account that paid Crane in '79 is the same account that wired payment to the Wells Fargo office in Helena 3 weeks ago, the day before Crane left Denver for Wyoming. The account is held in the name of a liquor merchant by the name of Mortimer Crane. Clara May's hand went to her mouth. Mortimer Crane and Silas Crane, she whispered. They are kin. Cousins, I believe, said Brody quietly. First cousins out of the same family in Northern Carolina. Mortimer the merchant, Silas the tracker. The merchant has the money. The tracker has the gun. The merchant pays the tracker for the family work. Eli Hartwell put down his coffee cup. He understood now. They all understood. The two stories that had been running side by side, the old story of Sarah's death and the new story of Mortimer Crane's wounded vanity, had never been two stories at all. They had been one story all along. 3 years ago, Silas Crane had come to Black Pine Hollow on a job. This job had been to clear the Hartwell brothers off the mountain because some Charleston speculator had heard a rumor of a gold seam under their land. Silas had set the fire that killed Sarah, and the brothers had not run, and the speculator had given up on the gold and gone on to other schemes, and Silas had been paid and had ridden away. Now, 3 years later, the same Charleston man had a different reason to want the Hartwell brothers dead. Now there was a girl who had shamed him, a girl who had run 2,500 miles into the arms of the same brothers who had once cost him his gold. And the same tracker was still alive, and the same tracker was happy to do the family work for the family rate. And the cousin in Charleston had wired the cousin in Denver and said, "Finish what you started and bring the girl back when you are done." Eli Hartwell looked across the cabin at his youngest brother on the settle, who had been carrying the weight of an autumn morning for 3 years for nothing. Then he looked at Clara May, and his face was the face of a man who had finally been given a name to put on his enemy. "Cyrus," he said, "thank you. I owe you a debt I cannot pay. Ride home tonight. Ride back to Copper Creek. Forget you came up here. If anyone asks, you came to deliver a tax notice. We will handle this from here. Eli." "Cyrus, please." Brody looked at him for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and he stood up and he put on his hat and he said, "If a man named Silas Crane should happen to die on the south slope of Black Pine in the next week, Eli, I would like the body brought to my office in Copper Creek so I can write the death certificate honest. You understand me?" "I understand you, Cyrus." "And the woman. What about the woman?" "She is yours, Eli. Anyone with eyes can see it. You take care of her. You hear me. You take care of her." Eli Hartwell did not answer. He did not need to. The attack came that same night. It came at 2:30 in the morning, when even careful men sometimes nod off at their watch. There were 4 of them. Silas Crane had hired 3 men out of a saloon in the Wyoming railhead and brought them up the mountain on borrowed horses, and the 4 of them came in on foot through the new snow with their rifles wrapped in canvas to keep the cold off the actions, and they meant to put the cabin in a crossfire from 3 sides, while Crane himself took the back door. But Jed Hartwell did not nod off at his watch. Jed had ridden with a Union Scout regiment at the very end of the war when he and his brothers were boys of 15 who had lied about their age to enlist, and only Jed had stayed past the surrender at Appomattox to help track Confederate raiders through the Tennessee hills, and Jed had not slept more than 4 hours a night in any month of any year since that war ended. Jed saw the first man cross the open ground at the woodline at 27 minutes past 2, and Jed put a bullet through that man's chest at 110 yards in the dark with one shot. The cabin came alive. Eli was at the front door before the echo of Jed's shot had died. Wyatt, weak as he was, dragged himself off the settle and crawled to the south window with the small Colt revolver Eli had given him, and Wyatt put his back against the wall and waited. Clara May did not run. She did not hide. She went to the iron stove in the kitchen, and she opened the door, and she took out a length of pine kindlings that she had been saving, and she lit the end of it from the fire, and she carried the burning brand to the small oil lamp on the kitchen table, and she stood there with the brand in one hand and the lamp in the other ready, because she had decided in the long hours of the afternoon that if a man came through her kitchen door, tonight she was going to set him on fire. The second attacker came up onto the porch. Eli shot him through the door. The third attacker tried to break a window on the east side. Wyatt shot him from the floor at the south window with the Colt, and the bullet was not clean, but it was enough, and the man fell backward into the snow and did not get up. The fourth attacker, the one Crane had paid the most, was a man named Bo Garrett, who had killed 3 men in barroom fights in Cheyenne, and Bo Garrett came around to the back of the cabin with an axe, and he chopped the back door off its hinges in 3 blows, and he came through the broken doorway with the axe still in his hand, and he saw a small woman in a navy blue dress standing in the kitchen with a burning brand and an oil lamp. Clara May Bennett threw the lamp. It hit Bo Garrett in the chest. The glass shattered. The lamp oil splashed across his coat and the burning brand caught the oil. And Bo Garrett went up like a winter haystack. He screamed. He dropped the axe. He turned and he ran out of the cabin into the snow with his coat in flames, and he was still running and still burning when Jed Hartwell shot him cleanly between the shoulder blades from the loft window, because Jed was a merciful man who did not believe any creature should die slowly when a bullet would do. The cabin went quiet. The whole fight had taken less than 4 minutes. 3 men were dead in the snow around the porch. The fourth was burning in the snow at the edge of the wood line. And Silas Crane, who had been waiting at the back of the cabin for his hired men to soften the door, had heard the lamp break and the screaming and the gunfire, and had understood in the cold, practical way of a man who had survived 20 years of this work that the job had gone wrong and that the next bullet was for him. He had turned and he had run. He had 2 hours of darkness left. He used them. The next morning Eli rose at first light. He did not eat. He did not speak. He saddled the gray gelding he kept for hard riding, and he loaded a pack with 3 days of jerky and a canteen and 40 rounds for the long rifle, and he came back into the cabin to take his coat from the peg, and Clara May was waiting for him by the door. "You said you would not ride alone." "I did not say that. I said I would think on it." "Eli." "Clara May, listen to me. He has a 2-hour start and a fresh horse, and he knows this country, and if I do not catch him today, he will go to ground for the winter and come back at us in the spring. I cannot let him have a winter to think on it. I have to ride now, today, alone, because Jed has to stay here and protect you and Wyatt. You know this is true. Tell me you know this is true." She did not say anything. She put both her hands flat on his chest on the front of his coat, and she pressed her forehead against the buttons of his shirt. He stood very still. After a moment, his great arms came up and he closed them around her, and he held her against him for the first time in the 5 weeks she had been in his house, and she felt the steady pounding of his heart against her cheek, and she heard him say very quietly into her hair the words he had promised on the porch. "Clara May, will you marry me when I come back? Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she said into his coat. "Yes, yes, come back to me. I will come back. Promise me, Eli." A Hartwell keeps his word. He kissed the top of her head, just the top of her head, just once, and then he turned and he walked out of the cabin and down the porch steps, and he swung up onto the gray gelding, and he rode south into the snow with a long rifle across his back and the morning sun rising at his left shoulder. And Clara May stood in the open doorway and watched him go until he was a small, dark shape against the white, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing at all. He was gone for 2 days. In those 2 days, Clara May did not sleep more than a handful of hours. Wyatt's wound began to heal cleanly. Jed kept the rifles loaded and walked the perimeter of the cabin every 2 hours through the night. The snow stopped falling. The temperature dropped. The world was very quiet and very white. On the second night, Clara May could bear it no longer. She went to the barn at first light of the third day. She saddled the small bay mare Wyatt had taught her to handle. She slid an old shotgun of Wyatt's into the saddle scabbard. She came back into the cabin and she put on her warmest wool dress and Eli's spare deer hide coat over it, the coat that smelled like him, and she pulled on the boots Wyatt had cut down to her size, and she went to the door. Jed was waiting for her at the door. "You are going after him." "I am." "You cannot." "Jed, step aside." "Miss Bennett, I cannot let you ride out into that country alone. You will die out there, and I cannot leave Wyatt undefended to ride with you. So either you stay or you do not go." Clara May looked up at him. "Jed Hartwell, listen to me. Your brother promised me he would come back. He has not come back. I am not going to sit in this kitchen and bake bread for a man who may be lying in the snow somewhere on the south slope with a wound he cannot bind by himself. I am going to find him. I am going alone if I must. But if you come with me, I will be safer, and Wyatt is strong enough now to hold this cabin alone for one day with a loft rifle and the door bolted. He is a Hartwell. He will hold." Jed stared at her. "You called him your husband this morning at first light. I was at the well drawing water, and you did not see me at the doorway. You said his name, and then you said the word husband after it, very quietly like a prayer. Why did you say it? Because he is." Jed looked at her for one more long moment. Then he went and he put on his coat and he picked up the long rifle from beside the door and he kissed his youngest brother on the forehead and told him to bolt the door behind them and not to open it for any voice but his own. And the two of them rode out into the snow together. The mountain man and the small woman in the deer hide coat that was 3 sizes too big for her riding south into the white silence to look for the eldest brother who had not come home. They found him at Cold Creek Pass 2 hours later. He was alive. He was on his knees in the snow, with his rifle empty beside him, and Silas Crane was on his knees facing him 3 feet away, with a Bowie knife in his hand, and the two men were both bleeding into the snow from a dozen places, and they had been fighting hand to hand on a frozen creek bank for what looked like a long time. Crane saw the riders coming first. He looked up. His face was a mask of blood. He raised the Bowie knife. Clara May Bennett pulled Wyatt's old shotgun from the scabbard, and she fired one barrel into the air over Silas Crane's head. Crane flinched. It was all the opening Eli Hartwell needed. He came up off his knees with the last of his strength, and he slammed his shoulder into Crane's chest and drove him backward into a great gray boulder at the edge of the creek, and Crane's head struck the boulder with a sound like an axe hitting frozen wood, and Crane went down and did not get up. Eli stood over him, swaying the empty rifle hanging at his side. He did not finish him. He looked down at the unconscious man in the bloody snow, the man who had killed his wife and hunted his bride, and he raised his Bowie knife once. And then slowly he lowered it. He turned his head and he saw Clara May Bennett sitting on a small bay mare at the edge of the trees with an empty shotgun in her hands and her cheeks streaked with frozen tears, and Eli Hartwell let the knife fall into the snow. "He is going to hang," he said hoarsely. "He is going to hang in Helena, in front of a judge with his name in the newspaper, so that the cousin in Charleston reads it over his morning coffee. That is the ending he gets. Not a knife in the snow, a rope in front of guards and witnesses for what he did to Sarah and what he tried to do to you." Then his knees gave out and he fell forward into the snow, and Clara May was off the horse and across the clearing before he hit the ground. She caught his shoulders. She turned him over. She held his bloody face in her 2 small hands, and she pressed her forehead to his, and she wept openly for the first time in front of him, openly and without shame. And she said his name over and over until his eyes opened. "Clara May. I am here. I am here. Oh, you came. I came. You promised you would wait. I lied. I am sorry. I lied. Forgive me." A small, slow smile moved across the bloody face of Eli Hartwell. The same small, slow smile she had seen the day she split the kindling. The smile his brothers had not seen in 3 years before her. And he reached up with one trembling, scarred hand, and he touched her cheek with his thumb very gently, the way a man touches the most precious thing he has ever been allowed to hold. "I am glad you lied," he whispered. Then his eyes closed, and Jed Hartwell was beside them in the snow, lifting his older brother into his arms, the way his older brother had once lifted him as a boy. And the 3 of them began the long ride back up the mountain to the cabin at Black Pine Hollow, where a youngest brother was waiting at a bolted door for the sound of voices he knew, and where the long winter was beginning at last to turn toward spring. The ride back up the mountain took 4 hours. Eli was conscious for some of it and not conscious for some of it, and Clara May rode behind Jed on the bay mare with her arms wrapped around Eli's chest from behind to keep him in the saddle, and his blood soaked through the front of her wool dress in a slow, warm tide that she did not feel because she was past feeling anything but the steady rise and fall of his breath against her arms. When they reached the cabin, Wyatt was already on the porch with the door open and the long table cleared and the water boiling on the stove because Jed had fired 3 signal shots from the South Ridge an hour out, and Wyatt had known what they meant. They laid Eli on the long oak table for the second time in a week. Clara May did not even take off her coat. She rolled up her sleeves and she washed her hands in the basin and she went to work. There was a knife wound across his ribs that had bled a great deal, but had stopped on its own in the cold. There was a deeper wound in his left thigh where Crane had gone in with the Bowie knife and missed the artery by less than a finger's width. There was a swelling at the back of his head from where his skull had struck the frozen creek bank during the fight. And there was a bullet graze across the meat of his right shoulder where one of the rounds from Crane's Colt had passed within an inch of taking the top of his lung. She closed the wounds one by one. She used the same silk thread and the same small, steady stitches. Wyatt assisted her, Lisan, because Wyatt knew herbs, and Wyatt knew where every bottle of tincture in the cabin was kept. And Jed stood at the door with a rifle because Jed had a rule now that no one in this house was without a rifle within reach until Silas Crane was on a rope in Helena. When she was finished, Eli was pale and breathing shallow, and his pulse was thready under her fingers. But he was alive, and Wyatt looked at her and said very quietly, "He will live, Clara May. You did not lose him. He will live." Clara May sat down on the bench beside the table, and she put her face in her hands, and for the second time in 5 weeks she cried where Eli could not see her. The fever came in the night the way fevers do. She sat by the carved settle where they had moved him, and she fed him sips of cold creek water, and she wiped his forehead with cloths cooled in melted snow. And the second night the fever broke just before dawn, and Eli Hartwell opened his whiskey-colored eyes and looked up at her, and said in a voice that was hardly more than air, "You are still here. I am still here. I dreamed you were. I am not a dream, Eli. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Will you come closer?" She came closer. She knelt beside the settle. He lifted his good hand, the one that was not bandaged, and he laid it against the side of her face, and he said, "When I am strong enough to stand on a porch and ask a question properly, I am going to ask you the question I told you about. I do not want to ask it lying down. A man does not ask a woman a question of that size lying down. Will you wait the few days it takes me to stand up? I will wait the rest of my life if you ask me to. I am asking you to wait a few days." Then a few days it is. He closed his eyes. A small, slow smile moved across his face, the smile she now knew belonged to her, and he slept again. He healed slowly. The body of a man who has bled that much does not come back in a week. But every morning Clara May woke before the others and built up the fire and brought him a cup of broth, and every afternoon she sat beside him and read aloud from the Plutarch in Latin and then in English, and every evening she helped him sit up against the bolster pillows so he could eat a real meal at the table by the hearth. Wyatt cooked. Jed kept watch. Outside, the snow lay deep and silent over Black Pine Hollow, and inside the cabin was warmer than it had been in 3 years. On the 8th morning, Eli Hartwell stood up. He stood up by himself, holding the back of the carved settle for balance, and he walked the length of the great room without help. And he came back and he sat down on the bench by the long oak table, and he was breathing hard, but he was upright. And Clara May looked at him from the kitchen doorway, and she understood that the question was coming today. It came after supper. The sun had gone down red over the western ridge, and the cabin was full of the warm smell of cornbread and stewed apples and good strong coffee. Wyatt had taken his coffee out onto the porch on some thin pretext about checking the weather. Jed had gone up to the loft to oil his rifles, which they all knew did not need oiling. Eli rose from the bench and he held out his hand to Clara May, and he said, "Walk with me." He led her out onto the porch. The snow stretched away under a sky full of cold, sharp stars. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the deep, clean cold of a Montana winter night. Eli walked her to the porch rail, and he turned to her gently to face him, and he reached into the inner pocket of his shirt, and he brought out something small and round wrapped in a square of white linen. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "Her name was Eleanor Hartwell. She wore this ring for 41 years on the third finger of her left hand. She died with it, and I took it off her hand the morning we buried her, and I have kept it in a tin box on the high shelf above the bookcase ever since, because I never thought I would have a reason to take it down. I have a reason now." He unfolded the linen. It was a thin band of plain gold with a single small blue stone set into it. The blue of the stone was the exact blue of Clara May Bennett's eyes. "Clara May Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina," said Eli Hartwell. He did not kneel. He stood very tall and very still on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands. "I am 36 years old. I am a widower. I live 10 miles from the nearest town and country that kills men who do not respect it. I have 2 brothers I love more than my own life. I have a grave on a rise behind this cabin that I will visit once a year for the rest of my days. I am not a young man, I am not an easy man, and I am not the kind of man who knows how to say pretty things. But I am asking you before God and these mountains and the memory of my father and the memory of my wife, who would have wanted me to ask, will you marry me? Will you stay here with me? Will you build the rest of your life under this roof with mine?" Clara May looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about a Charleston parsonage and a yellow fever epidemic and 6 years of scrubbing Aunt Hester's floors. She thought about a clipping pressed between the pages of Luke. She thought about a 9-day train ride and a snowy walk into the Silver Spur Saloon and a deep, slow voice from the darkest corner of the room. She thought about a Latin Plutarch and a chopping block and a daguerreotype in a cedar trunk and a bullet with a small, careful X scored across the front. She thought about every step that had brought her to this porch on this night in front of this man. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her hand. He kissed her. It was the first time. He bent his head down very slowly, as if asking permission with the slowness of it, and Clara May lifted her face to meet him, and his mouth touched hers softly and warmly under the cold, sharp Montana stars. And the kiss was the kind of kiss that the rest of a life can be built on. When it ended, he pressed his forehead to hers, and he held her against him with his good arm, and he said very quietly, "You are home now, Clara May. You are home now." "I am home," she said. The trial of Silas Crane was held in Helena 3 weeks later on a clear, cold morning at the end of February. Eli Hartwell was strong enough to ride down off the mountain by then, and he and Jed and Sheriff Cyrus Brody escorted Crane in chains to the courthouse. And Clara May rode with them because she had insisted, and because Eli had decided very early that he was not going to be the kind of husband who told his wife she could not see a thing through to its end. The judge was a hard old Union veteran named Calvin Pryor, who had no patience for hired killers, and the evidence was clean. Wyatt's testimony about the man on the ridge in '79, Sheriff Brody's wire from the Denver Marshal's office. The marked round Clara May had cut from Wyatt's belly. 2 of Crane's surviving hired men from the railhead in Wyoming, who were brought in by federal marshals and who, when offered reduced sentences for testimony, named Crane and named the cousin in Charleston who had paid for the work. Silas Crane was hanged at dawn on the 2nd of March, 1883, in the courtyard behind the Helena jail. He went up onto the gallows without a word, and he came down without a word, and the body was cut down and laid in a pine box and shipped on the next train east to Charleston, South Carolina, with a small typed card pinned to the lid that read, "By order of the territorial court property of Mortimer Crane, next of kin." Mortimer Crane received the box at the Charleston station 6 days later. He was arrested on the platform by federal marshals carrying a warrant from the Helena court for conspiracy to commit murder for hire and for the murder of Sarah Wells Hartwell. He was tried in Charleston in April. The conviction was clean. He was sentenced to 25 years at hard labor, and he was sent to the federal prison at Fort Jefferson, off the coast of Florida, where the air was hot and the work was breaking limestone in the noon sun, and where on the 19th of August, in the same year, he died of pneumonia in the prison infirmary at the age of 62. The newspapers in Charleston printed the obituary in 2 short lines on the back page. No one came to claim the body. Aunt Hester Bennett wrote a letter to Clara May in May. The letter was full of regret and full of careful explanations and full of small, bitter complaints about how lonely she was now, without her niece to keep the boarders' rooms in order. Clara May read the letter through twice. Then she walked across the great room to the hearth, and she dropped the letter into the fire, and she watched it burn. She did not write back. She never wrote back. Some doors a woman closes for good, and some prayers a woman stops praying, and some aunts a woman lets go of the way she would let go of a dead branch in the river current. They were married on the second Sunday of May, 1883, under the wide-spreading branches of the apple tree that Augustus Hartwell had planted 22 years before. The same apple tree under which Eli had married Sarah in the summer of '79. Clara May had asked very gently if it would hurt him to be married in that place again. And Eli had thought about it for a long time and had said, "No, it is the right place. It has always been the right place." Sarah would understand. Sarah was that kind of woman. The mountain heather was just beginning to bloom on the high meadows. The snow was gone from the south slopes and lay only in the deep-shaded hollows under the north faces of the firs. A new preacher had come to Copper Creek to replace the one whose wife had died in October, and the new preacher rode up the mountain on a borrowed mule and stood under the apple tree in his black coat with his Bible in his hands and read the words. Wyatt was the best man. Jed stood beside his older brother with one hand resting on Eli's shoulder the way their father had used to stand beside their mother at family suppers. Sheriff Cyrus Brody and his wife came up from Copper Creek as the witnesses. There was no other guest. There did not need to be. Clara May walked from the cabin door to the apple tree across the new grass in a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself in the winter evenings, and she carried a small bouquet of bluebells and Indian paintbrush that Wyatt had picked for her at first light, and she did not wear Sarah's dress because the cedar trunk in the attic still belonged to a woman she would not displace. When the preacher asked Eli the question, Eli did not say, "I do." He said, "I do, and I have done since the night she walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and asked the bartender for the leftovers. The doing did not begin today. Today is only the saying of it out loud." When the preacher asked Clara May the question, she said, "I do, and I will, and I am, and I have been, since the moment he stood up from the corner table and said, 'Ma'am, you come over here and sit down with us.'" The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Eli kissed her there under the apple tree with Wyatt weeping openly, and Jed turned slightly aside the way he turned aside when something hit him too hard to be looked at directly, and the new preacher folded his Bible, and the cabin door of Black Pine Hollow stood open behind them with the long oak table inside set for a wedding supper. Eli carried his bride across the threshold of his cabin in his strong arms, while the door closed softly behind them, and outside the first stars of the long Montana evening began to show themselves above the Bitterroot Range. The next day the seasons began to do what the seasons do. The first spring of their marriage, Clara May turned a patch of ground at the southeast corner of the cabin into a kitchen garden. Wyatt helped her dig the rows, and Jed built her a low fence of split rails to keep the deer out, and she planted potatoes and turnips and onions and peas and a small experimental row of tomato seeds she had ordered from a catalog in St. Louis. The first green shoot came up on the 8th of June. Clara May knelt in the dirt beside the row, and she touched the small green leaf with one finger, and she cried, and Eli came and stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and he said, "You are making this place live, Clara May. My father would have loved you. My mother would have loved you better than that." The first autumn brought the first fence project. Eli and Jed and Wyatt extended the corral to take in a new pasture on the lower meadow and bought 10 head of breeding stock from a rancher in Bozeman, and Clara May kept the books. She had a fine small hand and a head for numbers, and within a year she was running the entire ledger of the Hartwell Ranch. And Eli would sit across from her at the long oak table in the evenings and watch her add columns by lamplight and shake his head slowly in the wonder of a man who had never expected to be lucky in his lifetime. The first child came on the 14th of October, 1884. It was a hard birth. The labor began at sundown and went all the long cold night, and Wyatt, who had delivered foals and calves for years, and who had read every book on midwifery in his father's medical shelf, stayed by Clara May's side from the first contraction to the last. Jed rode down to Copper Creek in the dark for the doctor, but the doctor did not arrive until after the baby was born, because the baby was in a hurry to meet the world. Clara May bit down on a folded leather strap, and she did not scream once, but she squeezed Eli's hand so hard he had bruises on the back of it for a week. The baby was a boy. He came out red and furious and bawling, and Wyatt cleaned him and wrapped him in a clean linen sheet and laid him in his older brother's arms. Eli Hartwell, who had not wept in 3 years for Sarah, and had not wept since the day he learned the truth from Wyatt, sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and put his face down into the small, warm bundle, and wept the way men weep when the world has finally given them back something they had stopped daring to want. Clara May watched him from the pillow, with her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her own tears spilling over, and she said, "What shall we name him, husband?" "Augustus," said Eli without looking up. "His name is Augustus, after my father. I have been waiting to give that name to a boy for 18 years. Augustus Hartwell was christened by the new Copper Creek preacher in the second week of November, with Wyatt as godfather and Jed as godfather and a small local woman from town as godmother. He grew the way Hartwells grew, fast and strong and stubborn. He was walking by 10 months. He was talking by 16. He had his father's whiskey-colored eyes and his mother's honey-colored hair, and Wyatt swore he had Sarah's wide, warm laugh, although none of them could say how a child born 5 years after Sarah's death could possibly inherit her laugh, only that he did, and the cabin was full of the sound of it. The second winter passed quietly. The third brought a great blizzard that buried the cabin to the eaves for 6 days. The fourth brought Wyatt's wedding to a young schoolteacher named Hannah Bell, who had come up from Bozeman to take the new Copper Creek school, and who had walked into the general store on her first day in town and asked the storekeeper if there were any unmarried Hartwell brothers left because she had heard the stories. Wyatt and Hannah were married in the church at Copper Creek in the spring of 1887, and Wyatt built her a small cabin a half-mile down the slope from Black Pine Hollow, and Hannah came up the trail almost every afternoon to drink coffee with Clara May at the long oak table. The second child came in the late summer of 1889. A girl. Clara May had been the one to suggest the name, and Eli had wept again when she said it, and the girl was christened Sarah Eleanor Hartwell, after the wife who had been buried under the river stone on the rise behind the cabin, and after the mother whose ring Clara May now wore on her left hand. Little Sarah grew up, dark-haired and quiet and watchful, with the same wide, warm mouth as her namesake in the daguerreotype, and the cedar trunk in the attic that had once felt like a tomb began to feel slowly and quietly over the years, like a kind of inheritance. Jed Hartwell was the last of the brothers to marry. He held out for almost 5 more years. He held out until the autumn of 1894, when a young widow named Ruth Halverson from a Norwegian homestead 20 miles to the east lost her husband to a falling tree and was left with a little girl of 3¼ section of land she could not work alone. Jed rode out to help her bring in her hay because that was what mountain neighbors did, and he rode home that night without saying much. And the next morning he saddled the bay mare and rode back to the Halverson place, and he rode back almost every day for 6 weeks, and at the end of those 6 weeks he came home and stood in the doorway of the cabin and said to Eli, "Brother, I am going to ask Ruth Halverson to marry me. I wanted you to know first." Eli stood up from the table and crossed the room and embraced his middle brother. And Clara May said, "Bring her here for supper this Sunday. Bring the little girl. We will make her welcome." Ruth and Jed were married in the spring of 1895. Ruth's little girl, whose name was Ingrid, took to Clara May the way the small plant takes to a south-facing window. Within a year, she was calling Clara May Auntie and following her around the kitchen with a small wooden spoon. And within 2 years, she had two little Hartwell cousins of her own because Jed and Ruth wasted no time, and Black Pine Hollow began to fill with the sound of children that had never been there before. The third child of Eli and Clara May came in the spring of 1891. Another boy. They named him William after Clara May's grandfather, who had been a Methodist preacher in the mountains of Western Carolina before the war. William was born quiet and stayed quiet. He was the kind of child who would sit for an hour watching a beetle work its way across a porch board. Wyatt loved him fiercely from the moment he was born and taught him the names of every herb in the cabin rafters before he was 6. The years began to gather speed. Augustus learned to ride before he was 4. By the time he was 10, he was helping his father bring in the cattle from the high pasture in October. By the time he was 15, he was as tall as his uncles, all three of them, and the women in Copper Creek had begun to notice him at the church socials. By the time he was 20, he had married a girl named Mary Beth Carter from Bozeman, the daughter of the same rancher who had sold Eli his first 10 head of breeding stock back in '84, and the two of them built their own cabin on the eastern boundary of the Hartwell land. Sarah Eleanor grew up reading. She read every book on the long shelf in the great room before she was 12, and she read the Plutarch in English, and then asked her mother to teach her the Latin, and Clara May taught her Latin in the evenings the way Reverend Thomas Bennett had once taught his own daughter in a Charleston parsonage. By the time Sarah was 16, she had announced that she intended to go to the new women's college in Helena and study to be a teacher, and Eli, who had once said he would never let a daughter of his leave the mountain, hugged her tight and said, "Then you will go, Sarah girl. Your grandfather Augustus would have been so proud." William grew up tall and silent and patient. He became Wyatt's apprentice in everything to do with herbs and animals, and by the time he was 17, he was the one the neighbors sent for when a horse colicked or a cow got hung up in calving, and the doctors in Copper Creek came to call him the Hartwell boy who knows things. The cabin grew. In 1895, Eli and Jed and Wyatt added a second wing onto the original structure, doubling the upstairs and creating a long parlor downstairs, where the long oak table now sat permanently extended for the family suppers that had become a Sunday tradition. By the year 1900, there were sometimes 15 people at that table on a Sunday evening, 3 brothers and 3 wives, and 7 children, and the occasional traveling preacher or visiting neighbor, and the laughter rose up to the rafters where the dried herbs still hung in their bunches. And Clara May would look down the length of the table at her husband, with the gray, now silver at his temples, and she would think to herself very quietly, "You are home now, Clara May. You are home now." The signature phrases began to belong to other people too. The grandchildren learned them. Augustus's first son, a boy named Eli, after his grandfather would say, "Winter always ends, ma'am," whenever his cousins complained about the cold, mimicking the way his grandfather had been saying it for as long as anyone could remember. "A Hartwell keeps his word" became the family motto, said over handshakes and over deals and over the small daily promises that bind a family together. "The mountains take what they want, but they give back more" was carved into the lintel above the front door of the cabin in the year 1905, when Eli turned 59, and the carving was done by William, who had inherited his grandfather Augustus's gift for letters and who could carve in the old Latin script. The years moved. Sarah Eleanor went to Helena and graduated from the Women's College in 1910 with honors, and came back to teach in the new Copper Creek school that her Aunt Hannah had once taught in. She married a young Methodist preacher in 1912, a man who reminded Clara May of her own father in a way that took her breath away the first time she met him. Augustus and Mary Beth had 4 children. William, who had stayed at the cabin to work the ranch with his father and uncles, finally married in 1915, at the age of 24, a quiet woman from a farm down in the valley, and they moved into the eastern wing of the big cabin. The old cabin at Black Pine Hollow became a home full of the sound of children for the second time in its history. In the autumn of 1912, on a clear, cold afternoon in early October, when the maples on the slopes had turned a red so deep it looked like fire, Clara May Hartwell sat on the porch of the cabin in a rocking chair Eli had built her for her 40th birthday. Her hair was still honey-colored at the front, but it was silver at the temples now, and there were small, careful lines at the corners of her eyes from 30 years of mountain weather and from 30 years of laughing, and she was knitting a small white sweater for her newest grandchild, a boy who had been born to Augustus and Mary Beth in August. Eli sat beside her in his own rocking chair. He was 66 years old. His chestnut hair had gone silver almost completely, and his beard was white at the chin, and his right knee gave him trouble in the cold weather from a fall. He had taken off a horse in the winter of '98, but his shoulders were still broad, and his back was still straight, and his whiskey-colored eyes still saw everything that moved within a mile of the porch. He was reading aloud to her from a book of poems by Walt Whitman, the same volume he had read aloud to her on a winter night in 1890, when Augustus was a baby and Sarah was still a name they did not yet have a child to give to. In the front yard, Augustus's little boy, 4 years old and named for his grandfather, was learning to ride a small, spotted pony under the patient instruction of his great-uncle Wyatt. Wyatt was 66 himself, now the same age as his older brother, since they were triplets. But Wyatt had aged the most gently of the three, and his hair was still mostly chestnut, and his eyes still missed nothing. The little boy on the pony had his great-grandmother Eleanor's blue stone ring twinkling in the sunlight on his great-grandmother Clara May's left hand, because Clara May had taken to wearing the ring outside her glove on cold afternoons, so the child could see it shining when she waved at him. Sarah Eleanor was home from Copper Creek for the autumn afternoon, having walked up the mountain trail with her infant in a sling. She sat under the great old apple tree where her parents had been married 29 years ago, reading a book of Shakespeare, her own infant daughter asleep in a wicker basket beside her in the grass. William came up the path from the eastern wing carrying a basket of red apples his wife had just picked. He was tall and lean and walked the way his father had walked at his age, with a quiet economy that wasted nothing. Jed and Ruth came around the side of the cabin from the kitchen garden, Ruth carrying a basket of late tomatoes, Jed carrying a heavy iron pot for the canning. Jed's hair had gone fully white, and he walked with a cane now from an old wound that had never quite healed, but his rifle still hung above his bedroom door, and any man who came onto the Hartwell land uninvited was still met by a Hartwell with a question and a steady gaze. The wars he had fought in his life had not all been the war of his 19th year, and he had won them all. Margaret Bennett. Clara May's mother was 27 years dead. Reverend Thomas Bennett was 36 years dead. Aunt Hester had died in 1899 of a stroke in her boarding house in Charleston. The old Reverend Thaddeus Green, who had married Eli to Sarah, was dead. The new preacher who had married Eli to Clara May was dead. Sheriff Cyrus Brody was dead. Augustus Hartwell, the professor, had been dead for 48 years now. Eleanor Hartwell, the mother, had been dead for 36. Sarah Wells Hartwell still lay on the rise behind the cabin under a riverstone whose carving had not faded, and Clara May had carried fresh wildflowers to her grave on the 15th of June every year for 30 years on the anniversary of the wedding under the apple tree, because it had become her own private custom and because she had made a promise once in a cold attic to a woman she had never met. Eli set the book of Whitman down in his lap. He reached over and he took Clara May's hand in his. His hand was scarred and weathered and gnarled with the labor of a long life, and her hand was small and worn, and the gold ring with the blue stone caught the autumn light and threw it back up into both of their faces. Clara May. Yes, husband. Do you remember what I said to you on the porch the night I asked you to be my wife? I remember every word, husband. I said you were home now. You did. I want to say it again. I have been wanting to say it again for 30 years. You are home now, Clara May. You have always been home. This porch and this cabin and these mountains and the children and the grandchildren and the long table and the apple tree and the grave on the rise and the snow that comes every winter and goes every spring. This is your home, and I am your home, and you are mine. There is no other word for what we have built. The word is home, and you are it. Clara May laid her head on his shoulder. The little boy on the pony in the front yard called out, "Look, Grandma, I am riding by myself." And Wyatt let go the lead rope, and the pony walked 3 slow, patient steps with the boy's small hands gripping the saddle horn. And Clara May lifted her head from her husband's shoulder and clapped her hands and said, "Yes, my darling, you are riding by yourself, just like your grandfather did when he was your age." She still remembered. She would remember it until the day she died, and probably for some time after. She still remembered exactly what it had felt like to push open the door of the Silver Spur Saloon on a November night in 1882, with the snow on her shoulders and the hunger in her belly, and the last $10 of her father's secret savings spent on the train ticket she had taken into a country she had never seen. She still remembered the way the room had gone silent when she walked in. She still remembered the bartender's mouth twisting into the smile that was not a smile, and the moment she had braced herself for the first cruelty, and the deep, slow voice that had come instead from the darkest corner of the room, the voice that had said the words that had broken her open and made her whole on the same breath. "Ma'am, you come over here and sit down with us." She had come. Lord, she had come. She had walked across that floor on legs that would barely hold her, and she had sat down at a table with 3 giant, gentle strangers, and she had eaten the supper that had been offered to her, and she had been carried up a mountain in the snow into a cabin with a Latin book on the lowest shelf and a quilt on a narrow bed, and she had stayed for 1 winter, and the 1 winter had become a life, and the life had become this porch and this hand in hers and this small boy on the pony and the apple tree where the wedding had been, and the long oak table set for 15 at the Sunday supper, and the years had come, and the years had gone, and the mountain that had taken so much from Eli Hartwell had given him back in the end more than it had taken. Winter always ends. A Hartwell keeps his word. You are home now, Clara May. The mountains take what they want, but they give back more. The autumn sun moved slowly down the western sky over the Bitterroot Range. The little boy on the pony rode 3 more careful steps and then giggled and slipped sideways and was caught easily by his great-uncle Wyatt's strong hand. Sarah Eleanor turned a page of her Shakespeare under the apple tree. William carried the basket of red apples up onto the porch and set it gently at his mother's feet and kissed the top of her silver head and went inside to help his wife start the canning. Jed and Ruth stood in the kitchen garden in the long golden light, talking quietly about something only they could hear. And on the porch, Clara May Hartwell, who had been Clara May Bennett of Charleston, South Carolina, sat with her hand in her husband's hand and watched the world she had built with him spread out below her in the autumn light. And somewhere far down the mountain, 10 miles down through the dark trees and the small clear creeks, and the long rolling pasture, the old Silver Spur Saloon still stood at the edge of the small, dusty town of Copper Creek, and the door still opened and closed for new strangers walking in from the cold. And somewhere, surely somewhere on this great wide western country, tonight another lost girl was walking through another snow toward another small lit doorway, hoping for a kind word and ready for a cruel one. And Clara May Hartwell hoped, with the whole quiet weight of her 52 years and her 30 winters in these mountains behind her, that the girl would find what she had found, that the door would open, that the voice would come from the corner and would say the words that change a life. "Ma'am, you come over here and sit down with us. My supper is still untouched, and it would be a poor sort of insult to let it go cold." That was all it took sometimes. 1 supper, 1 stranger, 1 quiet, good man at a table in a corner of a saloon at the edge of the world. 1 yes, 1 ride up a mountain in the snow, 1 winter that became a life. The sun went down behind the western ridge. The cabin lights came on one by one. From inside, the smell of cornbread and stewed apples and good strong coffee began to drift out onto the porch. And somewhere in the great room, a child was laughing, and Eli Hartwell squeezed his wife's hand once very gently, and Clara May Hartwell squeezed back, and the long Montana evening began.